Alrighty then. We are recording. We are live. Is this working? Okay then. Hello and welcome to episode 113, or I guess it would be more correctly pronounced 113 of Question and Answer. I am your host, paññā. And we're starting a little bit late today. I mean, usually I start doing my Q&A videos around 2 in the afternoon my time, and now it's way after 5 o'clock. It may be dark by the time I'm done with this. Outside, that is. Probably the lights will still be on in here. But my woman and I were running around doing things earlier today, including we checked out what our old neighborhood was like, where we lived last year. And I think the electricity is still off on that side of town. There's so many trees that have fallen down. Our next door neighbor, the house that was closest to us, has their entire roof destroyed. And apparently they have no electricity either. It looked like a big oak tree or something had just fallen down onto their house. The house where we used to live, the front fence, there was like a wrought iron fence, that's wrecked. And parts of the roof were also damaged on the house we used to live in. So I guess it was good karma on our part that we moved here, where, I mean, we were right in the middle of the eye of the storm when it passed through, and our electricity didn't even go off. So praised be the gods. And I'm going to have a drink of my beverage here. And for those of you who know what the cup is, I know Styx was arrested. I don't care. So, also, another thing we did today was we sent a load of groceries to the airport, where they are flying the groceries to North Carolina, which is still a disaster area. I'm not exactly sure how bad of a disaster area it is, because, I mean, some of the people who live there who are making YouTube videos, you get these hysterical accounts of like bodies everywhere, and just the area around Asheville, North Carolina, it just has this stench of rotting flesh, and there's like corpses that are still like up in the trees that the government doesn't even want to take down and identify. They just want to bulldoze it all. And it seems to be a unanimous that the government is not helping. It is private citizens helping each other that is doing most of the good. And so anyone, I mean, do not be fooled by the fact that you're not hearing about this on most of the mainstream media, that it's not really news anymore, because it's still a disaster area. There are still people who don't have food or water or homes, because it's all been destroyed, and the roads have been destroyed, and it's just very difficult to get anyone or anything in or out of those areas. And FEMA, which is the US government's like organization for helping disaster victims, is out of money, because they spent all their money helping illegal aliens. So now that you've got a real disaster, they don't have any money. In fact, it just seems to be a unanimous account from, you know, people that you see doing these videos in the disaster area, that really the government is not helping all that much, if at all. And in some cases, they're doing worse than helping by sending people away, not letting people into help the victims. You know, they've got like truckloads of goods and so forth. They're trying to get in. The government will just send them away. Helicopter pilots, you know, they're trying to rescue people. The government just, I mean, threatens to arrest them, sends them away. And then the government is doing minimal efforts or minimal effects anyway in actually helping these people. So if you want to help, I think I'm going to have a link below, either just in the description of the video or like in a pinned comment or something, where you can order stuff through Amazon that will then go to this. It's like a realtors group in North Carolina that appears to be like serious, sincere, church-going Christian people who just consider it their sacred duty to help as many people as they can. It seems completely legit, and we have donated to that also. So with that as kind of a preamble, I guess I should start answering questions because we got lots of them. I didn't count how many there are, but there are lots. Lots of questions today. It's not that it was too high of a number for me to count, though. So at least it's a number low enough that I'm able to count that high. So anyways, the first question is from Twin Wasabi. And Twin Wasabi says, are all cultures equally valid? And that would depend on what you mean by valid. I'm not exactly sure what Twin Wasabi is referring to here when he says, are all cultures equally valid? I mean, what does valid mean? With regard to like the dharmic nature of a culture, you know, the amount of virtue in a culture, then certainly it's not the same. I mean, just look at like the Huns, for example, who seem to have been just completely amoral sociopaths with regard to anyone outside the tribe. You know, they saw anyone who was not a fellow Hun as just a thing to be exploited if they were in an exploity kind of a mood. So, I mean, with regard to validity, I mean, with regard to like adaptation to the environment, like in a Darwinian sense, then again, no, because some cultures prosper, other cultures not so much. So with regard to just like success or like strength, I mean, obviously not all cultures are the same. I mean, if you want to have sort of like a point of view with no value judgments, then you could say all cultures are equally like meaningless. But it does seem to me that some cultures are certainly preferable to other cultures from my own point of view. I would certainly prefer to live in some cultures and not in other cultures. I would not want to live in communist China, for example, even though the American government seems to be moving in that direction. Also, the EU government appears to be moving in that direction. So, are all cultures equally valid? I suppose Twin Wasabi should specify exactly what he means by valid. You know, what is a valid culture and what would be an invalid culture? But, I mean, all cultures are not created equal. Some cultures, I mean, to just about anybody, except for somebody who's completely apathetic or maybe fully enlightened and just above making distinctions like that. I mean, some cultures are just preferable to other cultures. So that would, going with value judgments, that would make them better than other cultures simply because more people like them. But I'm not exactly sure what Twin Wasabi was getting at with all cultures being equally valid. And so I think I'm just going to move on to the next question, which is from Athena's Sigil. And Athena's Sigil says, since you've lived in various countries and cultures, what are the differences between Buddhist countries versus Western ones in terms of social cohesion, fairness for citizens, treatment of animals, etc.? Are Buddhist societies better, worse, or is it all relative given economic and technological advantages in the West versus the Third World? I know quite a few Filipinos, and economically the Philippines is similar to many Theravada Buddhist countries. I'm not saying that they're saints, but even though poor economically, they're some of the most happy and content people I've ever met. Well, the number of Buddhist countries I've lived in, I mean, mainly Burma. That's the country I know the most about. I've spent a few weeks in Thailand, also a few weeks in Japan, maybe 2 weeks in Japan. Also worked on Japanese ships before I was a monk for months and months. So I have some knowledge of what Japanese culture or society is like, you know, living amongst Japanese people. So, let's see. What are the differences between Buddhist countries and Western ones? Well, I mean, I think you'd have to go on a country by country basis. Like Japan, in many respects, more closely resembles the West than it does a country like Burma. Japan, whether it's even a Buddhist country or not, is kind of debatable. You know, they've got Shinto, and most people probably aren't very religious there. You know, it's like you hire some kind of Buddhist priest to officiate at certain ceremonies, and it's just kind of like a business or just a tradition. They don't really understand Buddhism so much. Just like, you know, people don't understand the origin of Easter eggs and Christmas trees. You know, it's just part of their culture. They follow along with it. They don't think about it much. So how much Buddhism has really affected Japanese culture, maybe with regard to, you know, Japanese ideals of self-discipline and equanimity and stuff like that, I'm sure it must have permeated into the culture and affected it in that respect. With regard to Burma, again, it's, let's see, a Buddhist country like Burma, as opposed to a Western country like the USA. I mean, it's very different, but it's not just because of Buddhism. So it's hard to disentangle the Buddhism from other factors that are causing differences between, you know, a country like Burma and a country like the USA. You know, Burma is like a fourth world country. It's very undeveloped. It's ruled by a brutal and incompetent military dictatorship. And America is more or less of a representational democracy, a constitutional republic. So there's differences just along those lines too. But let's see, Athena Sigil says, in terms of social cohesion, well, see, social cohesion is not so much a matter of Buddhism or non-Buddhism. It's largely, I think, in a non-socialist society, you're going to have more social cohesion. Just like, you know, the disaster in Western North Carolina, it's the government isn't helping nearly as much as just fellow citizens are helping. And so social cohesion, it's like in Burma, in a Burmese village, somebody's house burns down. The neighbors all chip in and help build them a new house. I mean, the houses aren't very fancy. You know, they can build them a new house in a matter of a few days. But I mean, it was like that in America also back frontier times, you know, colonial times, where, you know, everybody knew everybody else, especially like everyone's going to the same church. There's a lot of that here in South Carolina. It's like church groups. You know, the church you go to is like helping the people that need help. You know, it's like somebody in the church still has their electricity going, so they offer their electricity to people who want to come over, take a hot shower, you know, use the chest freezer to store their food so it doesn't go bad, that kind of thing. So that's more like lack of alienation caused by just people interacting and relying upon one another instead of just being alienated like in the West and relying on the government, which isn't nearly as reliable in many respects. So fairness for citizens. Well, Burmese culture, very Buddhist, is not fair for citizens. You know, citizens have essentially no human rights. But I mean, that's not so much a matter of Buddhism as just a matter of other factors. Treatment of animals. I think Asian people in general do not have the same empathy towards animals as we Westerners do. And I really don't think that that's a matter of Buddhism versus non-Buddhism. I'm not exactly sure why it is that, like, people like the Burmese, they're very people-oriented. They don't like nature. That nature is just kind of unpredictable and scary. There's monsters and tigers and stuff out there. And you can just get lost in the forest if you're not careful. So, treatment of animals. In a way, in Burma, there's more of a, I don't know, it's a Buddhist thing where you shouldn't be mean to animals. And it's very low status. If you're a fisherman or something, or a butcher, very low status professions. And the people in Burma are very status oriented. You know, like even the pronouns, they don't just have like words, one word for me and another word for you. It's like there's at least half a dozen words for me and at least half a dozen words for you. And the pronouns that you use with regard to yourself and the other person, it depends on your relative social status largely. So it's hard to say because, you know, each country is different, and you might have one country like Burma where, you know, if you're a fisherman or a butcher or something, that's a low priority, you know, low status job, not low priority, but low status. And then someplace like Japan where, you know, they're doing the medical experiments on dogs and so forth with way less animal cruelty laws and so forth than in America. At least that's my understanding. So let's see, are Buddhist societies better, worse, or is it all relative given economic and technological advantages in the West versus the third world? I think that is largely it. That is probably more important in determining just like fairness for citizens and social cohesion and so forth. There would be other factors that are not religious. Although the more religious you are, like even in the West with church groups, like I was saying, they're more likely to like, you know, have a social cohesion and work together and help each other, as opposed to some alienated person living in an apartment building in a big city who doesn't even know his next door neighbors. In a Burmese village, everybody knows everybody else. So he's got a little commentary here about, I know quite a few Filipinos, and let's see, they're some of the most happy and content people I've ever met. And that's the same way in Burma. And I've pointed that out. And this could be like the general happiness of the people. That can definitely have something to do with whether they are Buddhist or like, you know, atheistic materialists, like possibly most people in the West, at least in Europe. Europe has way more atheists per 100 people than America does. And it's the same way in Burma. I used to point this out, and I got some like angry pushback when I would mention this in Dhamma talks, you know, when I'd come to America, that the average Burmese villager has less unhappiness in his life than the average American, with all the technology and the money and so forth, government programs, all of that. Although FEMA is not one of the beneficial government programs unless you happen to be an illegal immigrant. So yeah, the Burmese, they have less unhappiness in their life. They might have less positive happiness too. They probably have less fun than the average American. But I mean, I used to tell people this. It's like you go through a Burmese village and just count happy smiles, not fakey, you know, fake plastic, like glued on kind of smiles for appearance sake, but genuine happy smiles. And then go to a city in America, walk down the sidewalk and look at the people there that are just stone-faced. And it's very different. And I mean, that's the Burmese, it's the second noble truth of Buddhism. It's an easy explanation. Second noble truth of Buddhism. So it's like all suffering is caused by desire. And the Burmese have this phenomenal lack of desire. They can put up with stuff that Westerners cannot put up with. You know, they just accept it. You know, they're very accepting people as a general rule. So, I mean, that's partly because they're Buddhist, also partly because they are just stoic people living in a third world culture where, I mean, they're living pretty much at the same level, the standard of living as people in ancient times. So, yeah, it seems to me, with regard to certain things like general morality and general like moral ideals, that the religion of a society certainly will affect that. Although human nature is human nature, you're going to have kind-hearted people and cold-hearted people in any culture. But then again, like Burma or a third world, a traditional society is going to be more conformist. Individualism is less of a thing in traditionalist societies. So this is surprisingly a hard question to answer, because there's all these complex conditions that it's hard to disentangle the Buddhism or just the spirituality or the religion from other factors. So, I mean, but with regard to general happiness, a Buddhist culture does seem to be more conducive to general happiness, or at least lack of unhappiness, lack of dukkha, than most of what you find in the West. And so I'm going to move on to the next question. This is from Robin's Nest. And Robin's Nest says, I would like to ask your thoughts on Medicine Master Buddha of Lapis Lazuli Radiance, an important figure in the Mahayana and Vajrayana Buddhist canon. This is a particular Buddha I hear the most about, second only to Amitabha Buddha, in the Mahayana and Vajrayana canon. My first question is, 1. Do you think that praying Nianfo and or reciting mantra to or for a particular Buddha before meals, in particular with meat, and wishing them a better rebirth and dedication of merit, especially to a particular Buddha, e.g. Medicine Master Buddha, would work all the same in the Theravada tradition? Simplified, do you think dedication of merit and showing gratitude before meals, especially where you wish well for the deceased animal, generates merit regardless of whether the Buddha in mention canonically exists? This is not 2 questions, by the way. This is a simplification of the question, LOL. And then a little bit of a commentary here. Whenever I eat food, especially with meat, I recite the Medicine Master Buddha Dharani according to the sutra. I have a routine specific prayer I regularly do before eating food, which is usually longer when it's meat, LOL. Okay, so let's scroll up to the top. Do I think that praying Nianfo and or reciting mantra? Well, I don't know what Nianfo is. I think fo might be the Chinese word for Buddha. But the Nian before it, I don't know what that means. So let's just kind of skip Nianfo. Praying or reciting mantra to or for a particular Buddha. Well, in Theravada Buddhism, there really isn't much praying done. There's at least one sutta where the Buddha actually kind of ridicules praying. He says praying is like standing on one side of a river and then like begging the other side to come over on this side so you don't have to cross it. So, I mean, praying is really kind of unorthodox. A lot of devout Buddhists do pray, including Theravada Buddhists, and I'll get back to that. I once had a little bit of a discussion with a Burmese village doctor who said that he used to pray to the Buddha every day. And there's a question more specifically referring to that farther down the scroll, so I think I'll save the story. I've probably already told it before anyway. So do I think that praying or reciting a mantra to a particular Buddha before meals, let's see, and then would work the same in the Theravada tradition? Well, there's certainly nothing at all wrong with, like gratitude and well wishes towards the being that gave its life so that you could eat the food. At the very least, you're, in a way, you're like sending metta to some animal who is now deceased but has moved on to some other existence, possibly as another animal, probably as another animal. So there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. I've done that many times myself. Praying it's really not so much. I have prayed in my life, especially even as a monk. I think especially as a monk. But when I would pray, it was times when I was just at wit's end. You know, it's like anybody out there who's willing and able to help, please do so. You know, it wasn't even really directed towards anyone in particular. It was just anyone out there who's willing and able to help. You know, devas or enlightened beings with psychic powers, anything like that. You know, it was all fair game. So, I mean, praying to a Buddha that you don't think really exists or ever existed. I think Robin's Nest here is mainly referring to what is generally called medicine Buddha. And the Buddha images, he's holding like a little vial or bowl which contains medicine. You know, it's just like spiritual medicine. It's symbolic. I mean, if you believe that he really does exist, then at least this offering respect to him is fine. A lot of Buddhists, I mean, the main thing that you see in Theravada Buddhist society is that a lot of devout Buddhists, before they eat anything, they will take a little bit of it and offer it at their altar. You know, the Buddha statue has no desire for it. The Buddha himself has no desire for this food, but still, in a way, it's kind of making a small sacrifice that before you eat anything, you offer a little bit to the Buddha image on the altar. And in a way, you know, it's kind of fills the need for devotionalism in a lot of people. I never really did it myself. I really didn't see the point in offering rice and curry to a statue, but a lot of people do it. Also, as monks, I did live at certain monasteries where they would recite, you know, I eat this alms food not to beautify myself, make myself more attractive, to make myself look good, but just to keep me healthy so that I can continue practicing Dhamma. That kind of thing. That was chanted before each meal at certain monasteries where I used to stay. And my nose is itching very much. Just take a brief break here while I itch my nose. Okay. Let's see here. So, yeah, I mean, offering gratitude in general, that gratitude is really a underrated kind of emotion or feeling that actually there are some teachers, I think it was Paul Lowe used to say that gratitude will get you farther than equanimity. The equanimity can just kind of be a sort of apathy, whereas gratitude is just acceptance in a way. It's joyful acceptance. And that can get you farther. It can be a relatively powerful spiritual practice, just cultivating gratitude. And all of a sudden it reminds me of this movie, Holy Man, where Eddie Murphy plays this, you know, presumably enlightened being, or at least very spiritually advanced being. He's walking down the road and somebody throws a cup of like Fanta grape soda at him, and it splatters. He's wearing like this white robe. It splatters this purple stuff, and he just kind of looks at it and says, "Ah, grape. I love grape." You know, gratitude. He's so grateful at the opportunity to smell that grape beverage that is splattered all over his robe. So, yeah, I mean, praying, not so much in Theravada. Just offering gratitude or respect to beings, including the Buddha, who probably won't really care, or to the animal who is deceased, who also may not care. But really, when you're doing this kind of thing, it's for the sake of your own attitude. You know, you're making your own attitude more wholesome. It may be completely irrelevant to the animal that was killed, or the Buddha that may or may not exist, you know, out there somewhere. But it's like cultivating wholesome mental states in yourself. And if doing this little ritual of, saying grace of some sort before you eat, offering gratitude or respect before you eat, if it's helping you to have wholesome mental states, then it's fine. It's a good practice. So I think I'm just going to move on to the next question. Also from Robin's Nest. What is a good, proper, and meritorious manner? I think Robin's Nest means mantra or prayer, which is Theravada tradition infused and preferably English that one could use before eating food to gratitude. Well, the only real mantra or chant that I know before eating food that is a common one in Theravada before eating food is the one the monks do with regard to eating alms food. It's pretty much like I just said. And I used to recite it every day, and I've forgotten all the words in Pali now. But it's not really gratitude oriented. It's just I eat this food, not to beautify myself, not for fun, not for pleasure, but just to stay healthy so that I can continue practicing meditation, continue following Dhamma. So Theravada is definitely more dry of a system, more this sort of cerebral, less emotional, less devotionalistic, at least, as it originally was. A lot of devotionalism has been added, of course. So what is a good, proper, meritorious mantra or prayer? Yeah, the prayers, you're just not going to find prayers in Theravadan texts, really. Chants you can find, but I really can't think of like a Pali chant or an English translation of a Pali chant that is done by lay people before eating food to express gratitude. It's more done just through actions or just kind of off the cuff. It's just whatever feels good to you to do. And like I said, in Theravada Buddhist countries, they'll offer a little bit of their food to the Buddha image on the altar, do the bows, do whatever kind of prostration or little brief chant they do when they pay homage to the Buddha, and then they go and eat their food. But really, I guess there is a lot of gratitude towards the Buddha in like the heart of the person who is paying respect to the Buddha and offering some of their food to the Buddha, but not so much to the animal. So yeah, you may just have to invent your own if you do not want to recite what the monks at many monasteries recite with regard to it's in Burmese, Prithinka Yonitho, Pindapatam Pritewami, etc., etc. That's in Burmese pronunciation of Pali, which is how I pronounced all of my Pali for the many years that I lived in Burma. So I'm sorry that I can't really answer that question very well, because it's not really a Theravada Buddhist thing. Although I'm sure that there are Theravada Buddhists out there who have come up with something, maybe monks at monasteries in the West even, who have come up with some kind of agreeable, satisfying kind of chant to do before eating that is, it might be just sending metta. That's a possibility where you just send metta to all beings. But again, that's not so much gratitude as just like friendliness, benevolent feelings. So I think I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Sampapalapa. And Sampapalapa says, what do you think of Carl Jung's synchronicity? Sometimes I wonder if it can meet with Buddhism in some way, but ultimately it's just another delusion. Well, Buddhism at the conventional level also is largely another delusion. You're believing in people that really exist, like Gautama Buddha, who, like this person. That's delusional from the point of view of Buddhist philosophy, because there is no self. There is no person. So I do think that going just with conventional reality, like the conventional truth taught by Buddhism, Carl Jung's synchronicity really is not in conflict with that. In fact, it helps to I mean, it can serve as like evidence that really the mind is number one. I mean, Jung's synchronicity, he calls it an acausal connecting principle. I think that's what he calls it, an acausal connecting principle. But I don't understand the acausal part. I mean, there pretty much has to be some kind of cause in order for it to be an effect, you know? So, I mean, I think everybody's experienced synchronicity, or just weird coincidences, like meaningful coincidences that happen at a rate that is beyond what would be expected from random chance. So I do think that there is such a thing as synchronicity. And I think it just helps to point out that really the world we live in is mind-made. So that like certain aspects of our subconscious mind are conjuring up this synchronicity because it's conjuring up the reality in which we live, which includes that synchronicity, that meaningful coincidence. So I do think that Carl Jung's synchronicity, he can't really explain it. I mean, Buddhism can explain synchronicity better than Carl Jung could explain synchronicity, because it does happen. In fact, like the more you practice Dhamma, the more deeply you go into meditation, the more these weird coincidences and synchronicities happen. So, I mean, Jung was onto something. He was describing something that he couldn't really explain the why of it, really, unless it was like some sort of collective unconscious and archetypes or something. You know, it may be that he explained it somehow, but I don't think he explained it very well. I mean, I've got his essay on synchronicity on the bookcase back there, and I don't recall him actually explaining some kind of mechanism, because he's calling it acausal, which, I mean, it's practically random. I mean, he just can't come up with any kind of mechanism for exactly how it would work, possibly because Carl Jung still considered physical matter in an external world to be ultimately real, or at least real enough that we don't really have much, if any, control over it. But really we do. We just don't realize it because it's happening at a deeper level of consciousness. So I think I'm just going to move on to Sampapalapa's next question, which is, what if seeing the synchronicity of how your conceptions and then perceptions as a putujana paint this world with thoughts of self through our delusional me-mind perceptions, and karma kind of plays out as long as we have this delusion due to attachment to self and whatnot? Well, that's kind of a complicated sentence, isn't it? What if seeing the synchronicity of how your conceptions and perceptions paint this world with thoughts of self through our delusional me-mind perceptions, and karma kinds of plays out as long as we have this delusion due to attachment to self and whatnot? For some reason, this is a difficult question for me to understand. Okay, I'm going to try and simplify it. Get rid of some of the clauses that kind of break up the sentence and kind of fragment it. So, what if seeing the synchronicity of how your perceptions paint this world? Okay. It's not even a grammatically correct sentence as far as I can tell. That he kind of lost the thread of subject, object, you know, subject and predicate kind of a thing at some point. So what if seeing the synchronicity of how your conceptions paint this world, and then the sentence just kind of goes in a different direction after that, and that thought itself is not completed in a grammatically coherent manner. So, yeah, I'm not exactly sure what Sampapalapa is asking here. What if seeing the secret of how your perceptions paint this world with thoughts of self through our delusional me-mind perceptions and karma? Okay. What if seeing the synchronicity, this could be a half hour long for me to even get through this. What if seeing the synchronicity of how your perceptions paint this world kind of plays out as long as we have this delusion due to attachment to self and whatnot? Well, Yeah, I think that, I mean, the less attachment to self you have, though, you can have more synchronicity. Like I was already saying, that around like people like sages or people who are just doing intensive practice, synchronicity happens more. And it could be that you're becoming less attached, or whoever it is becoming less attached to the main rules that are like applied to samsaric reality, our version of it. You become less attached to that, and so more becomes possible. You can have more magic, you can have more miracles the less you are attached to the way things are supposed to be. So yeah, I mean, synchronicity would kind of be included in karma, and with an enlightened being, it would be more the karma of the people around that enlightened being rather than the enlightened being himself. He would just be kind of like a window who allows the miraculous, or, you know, whatever you want to call it, the paranormal, the synchronous. He allows it into this world kind of because he is sort of he's a liminal place. You know, he's sort of a weak spot in the rules. You know, he's not nearly so attached to the rules about how things are supposed to be in this version of reality. And so anything becomes more possible. But still, I'm not exactly sure if I've answered this question. Gosh. I think I'm just going to move on to Sampapalapa's third question. I hope I at least kind of knocked a dent into it. But that was kind of a weird question that I did not fully comprehend. So, Sampapalapa says, I watched an Ajahn Sona Dhamma talk on Right View, and he said that the Blessed One said that first there is mother and father. What's that about in your opinion? Where is that actually discussed in the discourses? I only own the Majjhima Nikaya at the moment, and it's not under Right View. I do think that you could probably find it in the Majjhima Nikaya. I didn't try to find it. I'm familiar with the quote, and I'm sure it's found more than once in the texts, that when you're talking about right view, that first there is father and mother. So right view just begins with the idea that you should honor your parents, that you do have a kind of karmic connection and obligation towards your parents. And then, you know, after that, it moves into, you know, there is like the giving, the result of giving, karma. I mean, it's essentially admitting to the existence of karma. That is the gist of this strange quote that starts with, first there is mother and father. And it's not really explained. You know, the commentators will explain it, but it apparently means first there is father and mother, or mother and father. It's just at the very beginning. I mean, you have a duty to your parents. You know, it's your own karma that landed you with these parents anyway. And then he moves on to just basic karma, just accepting that there are consequences, moral consequences to moral actions. That's the main gist of it. And there were some philosophers in the Buddhist time who were like materialists, who just did not believe that there was any such thing as karma, and thus that there was no such thing as right and wrong, except maybe just in like a pragmatic sense of, you know, there's a right way of like fixing a carriage, and then there's wrong ways of fixing it. So I mean, they might make distinctions between right and wrong in that sense, but not in the sense of ethics, really. That you could just go around murdering people, and if you didn't, and so long as you don't get arrested for it or lynched by a howling mob, that you haven't done anything wrong. There were philosophers who supposedly were saying that kind of stuff in the Buddhist time. So I guess I'll just move on to the next question then. This Q&A may be disappointing because there are some obscure kind of questions. And then like with that question, it's like I haven't read the text recently. You know, it's been years since I came across that text in my reading. And so, I mean, I understand the gist of it, but I can't really go into minute details about the specifics of it. So I'm just moving on to the next question. This is from Outer Haven. And Outer Haven says, would you ever go hunting? Can someone call themselves both a hunter and a Buddhist? Or are the two paths entirely incompatible? Sounds like you'd just be building negative karma. Well, I think the Buddha's last meal. No, it wasn't a butcher that offered his last meal. Never mind. He was a metalsmith. But, I mean, would I ever go hunting? I guess that's the first question. Ordinarily, no. But if there was like a zombie apocalypse, civilization collapses, the only way that I could feed myself and my family would be by going out and hunting, then there's a good chance that I actually would. And I know that I would be making bad karma, so to speak. But as a layperson, I mean, to some degree, as a layperson, you have to be a stoic. You have to acknowledge, okay, I cannot be a saint. It's just not appropriate for me as a man not to protect my family, not to provide for them. That, like, let's say in a disaster area, you know, it's like you got to go out and find something to eat. And it may be that you might have to steal it or loot a store or something, or you may have to hunt for it, because otherwise your family may starve. So something like that, I mean, you just have to admit, I mean, you don't try to justify saying, well, hunting's right under these circumstances. I mean, you're still going to be making bad karma. You just have to accept that and be willing to accept the consequences when they come back on you. So it requires a certain amount of stoicism, just the ability to accept the consequences of what one does instead of like yowling like a scalded cat when the consequences come back on you. So that's really missing a lot in modern society. In ancient times, classical society in the West, there was a lot of that. Just the acceptance, you know, I'm going to die. I could die a gnarly death tomorrow, and I just have to accept that. I mean, you might try to protect yourself and save yourself and not die a gnarly death, but it's going to happen sooner or later. So when it does to people around you, I mean, you may grieve and all that, but still you just have to accept this is just the way it is. And as a Buddhist, where you understand how karma works better than some ancient pagan, then still, I mean, it's karma. It's what goes around comes around. So you really have to just deal with the consequences of your actions and be willing to accept that when it happens. If you know something is disapproved of by Dhamma or the Buddha or wise people, and you decide to do it anyway, you just have to kind of say to yourself, well, I mean, I'm going to be making bad karma, so if I really want to do this, I have to be able to accept when the opposite happens back at me. And then, I mean, once you make your peace with that, you can continue and go forwards. You're still going to be doing something ethically wrong. You'll be making bad karma, but at least you're like taking responsibility for it. It's like you're owning it. And I mean, you have to acknowledge that there's going to be consequences. So can someone call themselves both a hunter and a Buddhist? I'm sure that in Burma, you know, you got the village butcher who usually is, well, if there are Muslims in the village, it's often a Muslim who is the village butcher, or fisherman. That there's a lot of Buddhist fishermen. And, you know, they just do the best they can. It's like I had one guy saying, well, I can keep 3 precepts. You know, I can keep 2.5 precepts, that kind of thing. If that's the best they can do, so long as you take, you know, well, let's see, how do I say this? I mean, generally, to be a Theravada Buddhist, you take 5 precepts and 3 refuges. Take the 3 refuges first. You take 3 refuges and 5 precepts, but everyone's going to be breaking precepts sometimes. So, I mean, you can be a hunter and a Buddhist at the same time. You can believe that Buddhism is true, and then you can sort of say, well, in my situation in life, I just can't be a saint. I'm going to have to be breaking certain precepts. And so you just have to accept that I'm not a very good Buddhist, even if I am a Buddhist. Something along those lines. So the two paths are not entirely incompatible. I mean, there's Zen master samurai, for example, that, it's like they have to interpret Buddhism in a way that it wasn't just completely condemning themselves, but still, I mean, you can still have the equanimity, the meditative mind, and the mindfulness. I mean, it helps you to be a sword master if you have equanimity and mindfulness. You don't lose your head. You don't start getting excited and agitated when you're fighting your enemy or whatever. So, yeah, I mean, pure Buddhism is mainly just for the heavy hitter renunciants meditating out in the forest. And then everybody else, they've got to just do the best they can. I mean, everybody is doing the best they can, including the heavy hitters out in the forest. But some people can't do nearly as well as that. They're still, they're keeping 2.5 precepts and not meditating. But still, they have some appreciation for what Dhamma says. And even though they may be doing something that Dhamma condemns, in a way, they're more careful about it. They're more conscious of it. They may be a little bit more mindful. Like I asked my teacher once, way back when I was just first entered the monastery, which is better, to do something wrong knowing that it's wrong, or to do something wrong not knowing that it's wrong. And my teacher gave me the surprising answer that it's better to do something wrong knowing that it's wrong. And the simile he gave is that if you pick something up knowing that it's hot, you're less likely to burn yourself than if you pick something up not knowing that it's hot. You're going to be careful when you do it. So, yeah, Buddhism, I assume, mass murderers could be Buddhists, even though they would be horrible Buddhists, sort of like, mafia hitmen are Catholics. So, yeah, you'd just be building negative karma. No, it wouldn't just be building negative karma, because at least, keeping Dhamma in mind is positive. Paying respect to the Buddha is positive. You can do a lot of positive things that to some degree can kind of counterbalance the negative stuff that you do. You can do a lot of bad karma and a lot of good karma in the same lifetime, on the same day. So, yeah, you can be a hunter and a Buddhist at the same time. It's just that you would not be practicing Buddhism nearly as well as the heavy hitter renunciant in, experiencing fourth jhāna out under a tree in the forest somewhere. And so I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Fred. And Fred says, can these Mahayana people tell lies and prove them? And then there's 3 question marks. And I assume he's responding to my take on the Tathagata Garbha Sutra, which is a relatively important Mahayana Buddhist sutra that starts off with just wild fairy tale miracle stuff going on. And Fred says, can these Mahayana people tell lies and prove them? Well, I mean, most Mahayana Buddhists are not really telling lies. I mean, you can say something that's just blatantly false or false and not be lying, because in order to lie, you have to have the deliberate intention to deceive. So if you are mistaken and then you repeat that mistake, that's not really lying. I mean, it may have started off as a lie somewhere along the lines, but if you believe that it's true and you're just repeating it, that's not lying, even if it's totally false. So, yeah, it is a weird phenomenon that's found in pretty much all religions. Islam, maybe not so much, but pretty much all religions will have fake scriptures attributed to the founder of the religion or some great saint or sage in that system that somebody had to have known at the beginning that they didn't really say that. Somebody had to make it up. But I mean, most Mahayana scriptures are this way, for example. Some of the books of the Bible are this way. So, I mean, there are honest ways that it could happen where, let's say you've got just this teaching of somebody who isn't the Buddha. You know, he's maybe a Buddhist. He's got some weird ideas, maybe. He starts this teaching and it strikes traction. A lot of people like what he taught and start repeating it. And then maybe 50 years later, after it's become entrenched in the society, people hear that and they just assume that the Buddha taught it. And it's, you know, it's kind of a weird, more or less heretical idea that nevertheless, a lot of people like it. They think that it's true. And so it winds up being incorporated into some kind of body of scripture. But in a lot of cases, I think somebody has to know that they're making stuff up and putting it into the mouth of, say, Gautama Buddha. But I think most Mahayana Buddhists who, for example, believe in the Tathagata Sutra, you know, they think that the Tathagata Sutra is authoritative, genuine teachings of the Buddha and all that. You know, they think that, and so they're not lying when they repeat it. Even though they may be mistaken, still it's an honest mistake. So if there were Mahayana people telling lies about this kind of stuff, it happened in ancient India, which had a very surreal kind of approach to reality, very dreamlike. And I mean, to this day in Burma, there's all kinds of just wild rumors and so forth that just get accepted as fact. That, you know, it's just sort of like the gullibility of certain people, and somebody's just making this guess. You know, it could be that you had some kind of nutty monk who had a vision. You know, he just saw in his mind the Buddha giving this speech, and then he just assumed that it was real. He repeats it, said the Buddha taught this, and then it catches traction, might even start a whole new school of Buddhism. So there are ways that some of the weirder, nuttier aspects of Mahayana Buddhism, just the stuff that's just flat out heresy from a Theravada Buddhist point of view, or the point of view of, you know, the early schools of Buddhism, the earliest schools of Buddhism. That, I mean, there could be that there was deliberate lies being told, but there are some other ways that I was kind of touching on that it could be kind of an honest mistake kind of a thing. But I mean, there's no way the Mahayana Buddhists could prove that the Buddha really did teach the Tathagata Sutra. Just like there's no way a Theravada Buddhist can prove that the Buddha taught the Satipatthana Sutta or the, Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta, anything like that. There's no way to prove it. I mean, you can work out, you know, some suttas are more likely than others to be authentic. And the stuff that comes after the early schools is much less likely to be authentic, because otherwise it'd be in the earlier schools too. I mean, Mahayana, really, they got to do some mental gymnastics to get around the idea that, I mean, just to believe that the Buddha really taught this. I mean, it's like the standard explanation. You got like three main approaches. One approach is like the approach taken by scholastics, for example, which is like even some Mahayana Buddhists acknowledge Mahayana Buddhism did not get taught by the Buddha himself. It did not arise until hundreds of years after the time of the Buddha. You know, that's one group. Another group, I think maybe even the traditional explanation for Mahayana is that the Buddha, it's so weird. This is like the official Mahayana interpretation, that even the Buddha's main disciples, like Sariputta and Moggallana, were not wise enough. Even though they were fully enlightened, they were not wise enough to appreciate Mahayana. And so the Buddha had like these secret teachings where, according to the Tathagata Sutra, they were like, it was like trillions and trillions of beings listening to these talks, including monks. He's just performing these wild, spectacular miracles, and that somehow none of the early, like Theravada, proto-Theravada Buddhists were there. You know, it's like, it's just so absurd. It's so unlikely that the Buddha would have taught an entirely different message that in some respects contradicts, what is considered to be Orthodox early Buddhism, without the Orthodox early Buddhists being aware of it. That he just had like this completely other religion, practically, that for some reason even his chief disciples were oblivious to. Well, it's just nonsense. And then there's a third explanation where you can say that, let's see, what would be the third explanation? I was thinking about this a little earlier. Let's see. Oh yeah, it would be a kind of conspiracy theory where the Buddha taught all this Mahayana stuff with thousands of monks in attendance, like it says in the texts, including all these bodhisattvas and beings from pure lands and stuff coming. And that this conspiracy was that the earlier schools of Buddhism just didn't like that stuff and just conspired to delete it all from their own texts, which also doesn't seem very likely. So the likeliest explanation is that the Buddha just never taught it and it just got added later, which is even what a lot of Mahayana scholars admit to. And so I think that's a bit of a digression, and I should move on because we got lots of questions today, and I've already been going for an hour. So the next question is from Drunk Druck. And oh, here you go. I already mentioned this. Drunk Druck says, can you elaborate more on so-called Buddha land? Almost sounds like a meditation theme park. Well, I assume he's referring to this Tathagata Garbha Sutra again, where there was 60 times as many bodhisattvas as there are sand grains in the Ganges. And a person on the Discord server actually went to an AI to determine how many sand grains are in the Ganges, and it was up in the sextillions. So you'd have to multiply that by 60 sextillions. And they all came from Buddha lands or pure lands. And the pure land or Buddha lands is nowhere to be found. There's not the slightest hint of it in the Pali text that I am aware of. It was, it's an aspect of Pure Land Buddhism. And ironically, Pure Land Buddhism is one of the earlier schools of Mahayana to arise, according to experts like, what's his name, A.K. Warder, in his book on Indian Buddhism. He pointed out one of the earliest acknowledged schools of Mahayana Buddhism was Pure Land, which according to him arose in southern India. And Pure Land Buddhism, I've heard it said that Pure Land Buddhism is like Christianity for Buddhists, where you've got certain Buddhas who will generate this like paradise. And if you pray to these Buddhas, you can be reborn into that paradise. And I had a Pure Land Buddhism try to explain that these Buddha lands aren't even in samsara. In a way, they're indistinguishable from nibbana or nirvana already, which is just kind of a mind blower to someone who knows, what samsara is, where it's, diversified and has qualities and aspects, and the absolute, which doesn't. So, yeah, it's just this weird idea cooked up by not so early Buddhists, but still ancient ones, that there are Buddhas who create this paradise. Why Gautama didn't create one, they don't really say, unless they're saying that just ancient India and the Ganges Valley basin was his paradise that he created, but the evidence doesn't seem to support that very well. So these Buddhas, they create this kind of paradise world where it's very easy to become enlightened. So, it's just ruled by this enlightened being, it's just righteousness prevails. It's just saturated with Dharma. You pray or just recite his name over and over and over again. Just keep your mind directed on this Buddha. He will allow you, apparently, to be reborn into this paradise world where you become enlightened more easily. And the Gautama Buddha, apparently, based on the earliest text, would never say such a thing. And in fact, he would probably denounce such a theory. He's saying, get enlightened in this very life if you can. Don't postpone it. Don't pray to anybody. Don't try to wind up reborn. I mean, that's one of the teachings of early Buddhism. You should not be desiring rebirth of any sort whatsoever. So that's what the so-called Buddha lands are. And I'm going to move on to the next question. This is from David Jr. And David Jr. says, here, just a second, I got to fix something here. All right. David Jr. says, Buddhists believe in reincarnation, but say it is not the soul or consciousness of the dead person that reincarnates, but the karma consequences of how this person lived. So his first question is, why should this newly born person inherit this karma? Why should this karma belong to them if it's not the same consciousness or soul? Well, see, there's not only no soul in Buddhism. So many people do not get this. There's not only no soul in Buddhism, there is no self at all. There is no person in reality. So all of this is just kind of like a virtual reality. So you can say there's a virtual soul that gets virtually reincarnated as this new virtual person. You can say that if you want to, but in ultimate truth, there's none of that. So what passes from one person from one life to the next, the only thing, according to Theravada Buddhism, that transmigrates from one life to the next is karma, and that is just the momentum of the mental states. It's like the psychic momentum, the stream of consciousness, if you like. That is what gets reincarnated. It's not ultimately real, though. In Theravada Buddhism, you could say that the mind moments of these mental states are ultimately real, but the person isn't, regardless. So why should this newly born person inherit this karma? They've got the same momentum. They've got the same momentum of mental states, the same psychic momentum. So when it stops here, it just starts. It starts again as soon as it stops. You know, it's sort of like pushing down a lump in the carpet that just causes the lump to arise somewhere else. It's not the same piece of carpet, but it's like has the same characteristics because it's simply this lump, you know, being transferred to a different lump. If that helps. So there is no newly born person to inherit anything ultimately. It's just karmic momentum, and even that is at the level of, you know, samsara, not the level of the ultimate. Okay, so why should this karma belong to them if it's not the same consciousness or soul? Well, it's not the same consciousness from one moment to the next. You're not the same person from one moment to the next. So I mean, might as well add that as an additional problem. I mean, it's rebirth is happening every moment because it's like different body, different mental states from one moment to the next. According to Theravada, you know, everything is in flux, and like even matter, even physical matter, which Theravada accepts. I don't personally. But Abhidhamma, the Abhidhamma philosophy accepts that physical matter is ultimately real, but it's flashing in and out of existence at like, what is it? A trillion times a second. And, you know, it just ceases to exist, reappears. So it's different from one moment to the next. So I kind of answered that one. So I'm moving on to David Jr.'s next question. How can you talk about the desire to end your cycles of rebirth if you are not being reborn? Well, it's not really you. I mean, that's what I'm saying. It's not only is there no soul, there's no person at all. But we are stuck in this illusion that there are people and souls. And so you're trying to get out of the illusion. You're trying to get out of the matrix. You're trying to get out of the virtual reality and into ultimate reality, in which there will be no you anymore because there never was a you ultimately. So you can talk about the desire to end your cycles of rebirth without you actually being reborn, simply because you want this virtual reality with virtual suffering and virtual delusion to stop. And then, I mean, going with Upanishadic language, you just merge with the infinite. You know, all the barriers are down, and there's just, you just merge with the ultimate. But you're not really not supposed to crave that, because that craving is just another kind of craving which gets you stuck. So you just practice Dhamma as a kind of sacred duty, or whatever, just something that you are moved to do. And then you get wiser and wiser, and the illusion gets dimmer and just eventually just kind of fades out, or just poofs out all of a sudden. Okay, so I suppose I answered that one. I'm going to move on to David Jr.'s third question, which is, what is reaching enlightenment? What is becoming a Buddha, and why seek it? Well, I mean, the Buddha has different meanings. It originally just meant awakened one, you know, an enlightened being. And sometimes there are a few texts in which the ordinary enlightened being is called a Buddha. And so it may be that David Jr. is asking about becoming an Arahant, just an enlightened being. Because a Buddha in Theravada, also in Mahayana, has acquired a different meaning, where it's like way more exalted than ordinary enlightened being. Mahayana Buddhists would even go so far to say that an ordinary enlightened being, or Arahant, isn't even fully enlightened, even though they certainly are based on the early texts. So what is reaching enlightenment? Reaching enlightenment is just awareness of ultimate reality, awareness of the Kantian thing in itself, as opposed to the Kantian thing as it seems. So you've gotten out of the matrix. But there's no you after you've gotten out of the matrix, because you are, generating your own matrix. You don't really exist. It's all just this interconnected web of illusion, essentially. So reaching enlightenment is reaching or attaining full awareness of reality instead of just wallowing in delusion. Why seek it? If you like being deluded and unhappy, then there's no real reason to seek it, I guess. But all suffering and delusion are samsaric. They do not exist in ultimate reality unless you're an Abhidhamma scholar, and then you can say that suffering and delusion are ultimately real, even though people are ultimately real. But mainly, why seek enlightenment? Because once you're enlightened, you are no longer stuck in delusion and suffering. It's better than heaven. And I'm going to move on to the next question. This is from Anthony. Anthony says, it is said that the Buddha was clairvoyant. I knew a Buddhist who said that he prayed to the Buddha because he knew that time was not a constraint on the Buddha and could hear his prayers all the way in the past. What do you think of these theories? This is the little story that I was warning you about, that I was going to mention. Here, I got to adjust this. Oh, okay, it's adjusted. I didn't need to adjust it. So I had this talk with a Burmese village doctor. He was the village doctor in the village of viññāna in central Burma. Very nice guy. And he told me that he prays to the Buddha every day. And I asked him, why do you pray to the Buddha every day when the Buddha is dead and he can't hear you? He's no longer in this world. And the doctor told me, well, the Buddha can look into the future and see and hear me praying to him, which even that is not good Theravada Buddhism, because according to Theravada Buddhism, only the present moment exists. They mocked the Sarvastivada Buddhists, who said that the future and the past still exist in a sense, sort of like Einstein saying that time is just the fourth dimension. So that the past, present, and future all in a sense are simultaneous. But in the orthodox point of view of Theravada Buddhism, which the Burmese are supposed to accept without question, is that only the present moment exists. The future does not exist yet. The past no longer exists. So the Buddha cannot see into the future other than by extrapolating, just using like superhuman logic, logical extrapolation to see general trends, but he won't be able to get past people making decisions that are not deterministic. People are not completely locked into determinism, even though free will also is something that Theravada Buddhism doesn't really accept. So it's a paradoxical state, enigmatic state, where both free will and determinism are both they're both rejected. But the Buddha cannot really see the future. All he can do is just extrapolate and go with probabilities. So even then, it's hardly likely that the Buddha would have looked into the future and have seen this good village doctor praying to him, unless he just had like this omniscience where he's just seeing every possible scenario. And then he'll be seeing this doctor praying to him, also this doctor cursing him, and then his next door neighbor praying to him, and all these possibilities. So, what do I think of these theories? It's pretty much what I was saying a little earlier with regard to making prayers in general, in that when you're praying to a Buddha, the Buddha is probably not going to know about it. You're sending metta to an animal who died so that you can eat that ribeye steak. The animal probably is going to be completely oblivious to any of that. But what you're doing is you're cultivating your own wholesome mental states. You're cultivating reverence and respect and gratitude and good feeling towards others, like benevolence and so forth. So it's mainly subjective. Whether it has any effect beyond your subjective experience is largely irrelevant. So you can pray to the Buddha, but probably the Buddha is not going to be listening or caring. Unless he's just totally omniscient and is seeing all possible scenarios, including that one, which is just like infinitesimal speck compared with everything else. So when you're praying, when you're sending metta and so forth, most of it, the overwhelming majority of it, is just cultivating subjective, wholesome mental states, regardless of any effects it has out there in the world somewhere. And I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Skoladin or Skuladin. And he says, is bias something to overcome? Some biases you can overcome. I think people with Trump derangement syndrome would do well to overcome that particular bias. It just, it skews your reality and causes greater delusion. Although a certain amount of bias is just part of the human condition. I don't know if anyone is going to be completely free of bias. Even a fully enlightened being may still have like vestigial bias, even though they're not identified with it anymore. It's just nature taking its course, and they're equanimous while they're biased, but still it's just sort of vestigial. And just being human is going to cause bias. We're biased against like bitter tastes and biased in favor of like sweet or rich or savory tastes. We're biased against stink, like rotting meat or a cat fart. And we're biased in favor of more good smelling smells like flowers or baking bread, for example. It's just built into us that we have certain biases. So I guess I should have read his little explanatory commentary before answering the question. So his question is bias something to overcome? And then he says, I'm not even sure how that would work, considering how much bias is integrated into communications. Like if I were to say the three following words, literally yellow bird, most likely the listener has a mental image just from that, even though it was vague and could have referred to anything from a real bird to a cartoon bird. And if it was a reference to a cartoon bird, it could have been a Tweety bird or Woodstock from Peanuts. So yeah, certain biases, you can overcome them, and you do well to overcome them because it's a kind of delusion. Other kind of biases we're just stuck with because of being a human being, or because we were just born to a culture that makes certain assumptions and we just absorb those assumptions. So nevertheless, it is good to keep bias to a minimum if possible. Try not to be so biased that you're just completely irrational, for example. So I'm just going to move on to Skoladin's next question, which is, would you kindly explain the relationship between conventional reality and ultimate reality? And then his little commentary here is, it kind of sounds like conventional reality is symbolic to the thing itself. Like when people look at the stars in the sky, they're not seeing the thing in itself, but the thing as it was across light years. Or perhaps it's more delusional, like the moon, which does not emit its own source of light, but dilutes, I assume he means, it dilutes that of the sun. I don't know. I'd hate to find out the uncarved slab is a black mirror that reflects karma or something. Okay, conventional reality is symbolic. Yeah, ultimately, conventional reality, it's not just misinterpreting sense data, because you can't just have bare, uninterpreted sense data. There was some medieval Buddhist philosopher of the Dignaga school, Venerable Dharmodara, I think his name was, who pointed out, and this is profound, that sense data that has no kind of perceptual interpretation is as though it just doesn't exist at all. So I'm not exactly sure why I mentioned that, but it's not just a matter of you see a star and then you misinterpret that star, and that's the star is the ultimate reality and the misinterpretation is conventional reality, because in a way you're just creating the star that just out of like primordial chaos, and that's probably not going to be understood very well, but it's like the block of marble. It's my theory of everything is the block of marble, and inside that block of marble you have an infinite number of virtual potential statues. Every single molecule of every statue is right there where it has to be. All you got to do is just remove the extraneous rock, and that statue is already in there. And so conventional reality is like singling out some statue in that rock and assuming that it's real. You're just, with your mind, you're just dismissing the extraneous rock, and you're just seeing that statue and assuming that statue to be real. Or more to the point is, you are one of the statues, and you're a statue that's so complicated, so intricate, that it has become self-referential and starts believing that it's a real thing. It's not just a conditional, provisional, virtual statue contained in a block of marble. It thinks that it's already carved. It's legit. It's the real deal. So ultimate truth would just be the uncarved block, and all conventional truth would be singling out this statue or that statue or this group of statues in that uncarved block, and thinking, if you're delusional, that it's real. An enlightened being might just still single out statues, but at least he knows that they're not real, that they are virtual statues contained in this uncarved block. So you could say that just the perception is all that is real other than the uncarved block, because it's the perception that is singling out these virtual statues. Okay. So then I move on to Skoladin's third question. I assume he intended it to be pronounced Skoladin, but I think Aladdin, as pronounced in English, in like Arabic would have been something more like Aladdin. Anyway. So anyways, here's the third question. Hypothetically, if the wind blew and enlightenment was offered and the person rejected it because they were young, did they soft block themselves like they missed their chance this lifetime? Well, I mean, if you're offered enlightenment somehow through some miracle, I don't know about the wind blowing and doing it, but I mean, if you were offered enlightenment, then yeah, you should go for it. You certainly you shouldn't say, well, I'm still young, I don't want to be enlightened yet. But I mean, if you become enlightened when you're young, you're still going to be young. It's not going to like take away your youth. I guess Sri Shankara, who is one of the founding fathers of Advaita Vedanta. He became enlightened when he was a child, according to tradition. He probably remained a virgin and so forth. Never danced or drank or anything, maybe. But still, I mean, it's better to be enlightened than to be like a wild teenager anyway. I speak from experience because I used to be a wild teenager. Not extremely wild. I never got imprisoned or anything. So I nevertheless have come to the conclusion long ago that if somebody did somehow miraculously invent an enlightenment pill, and if you took this pill, you would become enlightened, I think even most monks would run away from it in terror, as though it were some rabid demon-possessed snake. That most people just do not want enlightenment. I mean, that's the main reason why we're not enlightened right now, is because we don't even want to be enlightened. We're continually trying to remain unenlightened. We like being unenlightened. Mainly because we don't know any better. So let's see, just read the question again. Hypothetically, if the wind blew and enlightenment was offered and the person rejected it because they were young, did they soft block themselves? Yeah, well, they just pretty much fucked themselves up royally. Like they missed their chance in this lifetime. They might not have missed their only chance, but certainly they missed their 100% certain chance. And now it's like total long shot material. So, yeah. They fucked up is what they did. And I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Pyramid. And Pyramid says, I'm surprised a Buddhist monk is that familiar with Mormonism. Have any missionaries ever come to your house? If so, did you end up having discussions or just telling them to leave? Well, the main reason why I'm familiar with Mormonism is that I have read the Book of Mormon. I think I read it in a cave in Burma. It was just an English book that I had access to, so I read it. And it was astonishing. It was just really a bad book, in my opinion. But have any missionaries ever come to my house? The only Mormon missionary I ever spoke with, I was walking through a university campus, talking to some guy who was cultivating association with me. He just asking me lots of questions and stuff. And so we're just walking along. I got my robes and my bare feet, my shaved head and all that. And this Mormon missionary came up to me, all smiles, and he asked me if I've ever read the Book of Mormon. And I said, yeah, actually, I have read the Book of Mormon. And he's like, what did you think of it? It was just setting himself up. And I'm thinking, and I said, well, I think it's very unlikely that American Indians are a race of degenerate Jews who were punished by God for not believing in Jesus hundreds of years before Jesus was born. And then, of course, the smile just kind of evaporated, and he implied that I didn't really understand the Book of Mormon very well, but that's obviously what the Book of Mormon is about. I think a lot of Mormons, more intelligent, sensible Mormons, kind of have tried to back away from a literal interpretation of the Book of Mormon, even though the Book of Mormon was clearly intended to be interpreted literally. But with regard to the more advanced Mormon philosophy that has come up, has been, devised or revealed in later times, I really don't know that much about it. I know a little bit about the temple garments, the special underwear that high-ranking Mormons have to wear all the time, so that when they take a shower, they just kind of pull it off till it's around one ankle and leave that ankle with the long johns kind of sticking out of the shower when they take a shower, that kind of thing. So that's about it. And I guess I should just move on because I answered the question. So it does make sense that after I've answered the question, I should move on to the next question, because otherwise we never get to the end of this. So the next question is from Power. And Power says, has Father Fish replaced Diogenes as your main guru? Well, Diogenes was never my main guru, really. He was kind of a role model when I was a teenager. My father was the first person to tell me about Diogenes the Cynic, Diogenes of Sinopa, who was like a founder of classical cynicism in ancient Greece. But I I don't think he was ever really my main guru. Father Fish, I call him my guru partly because I watch a lot of Father Fish videos, and I try to set up my aquarium in accordance with the teachings of Venerable Father Fish. Although, as I've mentioned before, I kind of messed up by not putting a layer of soil under my sand, but I do have a well-established food web going in there now. My fish really don't have to get fed very much at all because it's all like a self-contained food web going on in there. But my main guru, it's hard to say. I think my main guru, just if I were asked who my main guru is, even though I'm not thinking about this kind of stuff nearly as much, it's a good chance it would be Neem Karoli Baba, whose picture is up there on the altar. That I've felt the most devotional or like a deep connection with Neem Karoli Baba than with any other spiritual teacher, even though I've never met him. A friend of mine actually did meet Neem Karoli Baba, and I was just amazed. You know, I was like, wow, what did he say? And my friend told me the only thing he ever said to him was, he had shaved his head recently. The friend, and not Neem Karoli Baba, he'd started being shaven headed, and Neem Karoli Baba asked him why he started shaving his head. That was the only thing he ever said to him personally. So that was a little disappointing for me. You know, it was nothing profound. Just, why did you start shaving your head? So, I mean, some people might be disappointed that my main guru is not Buddhist, but I mean, I really don't look, I mean, the Buddha himself is so far in the past, in the distant past, that you don't see him, I don't see him so much as like an individual person. He's like a legend. You know, it's sort of almost like Socrates. I mean, he's probably more legendary than Socrates, maybe not quite as legendary as Hercules, but I mean, you don't really know for sure, you know, what he was like. It's just, you just get this vague image, or at least I do, because I'm not a dogmatist that just accepts whatever I'm told with regard to the Buddha, because some of it's just unbelievable. So, and I just really don't have that much of a devotionalist bent. Like Taungpulu Sayadaw, you know, or Ajahn Chah, somebody like that, they could be my guru, but I really didn't have that kind of attitude as a Theravada Buddhist. I still don't. Theravada Buddhism, you know, it's not really guru oriented. You have dependence on a teacher as a junior monk. You can have a teacher, a venerable teacher, someone you revere. So I guess that would be a kind of guru. But I never really had a Theravada Buddhist teacher who I considered to be enlightened. Some of them were wise. I mean, all of them knew things that I didn't know. But, yeah, I never really met somebody that I considered to be a Sat Guru, or just, you know, sort of like the absolute personified. Neem Karoli Baba comes close to that. He might be the one. But even Diogenes of Sinope was not the absolute personified, and Father Fish was not the absolute personified, unless everybody is the absolute personified. So, I think I'm just going to move on to Power's next question, which is, there's a DJ Buddhist monk in Korea who uses Buddhist themes and iconography in his music. His goal is apparently to try to make Buddhism appealing to a younger audience, but some monks are arguing that this DJ Buddhist monk is making a mockery of the faith. He's even been banned in some Asian countries from performing. What is your take? Well, I wouldn't be surprised if Burma is one of the countries that banned him. There was, this was back around 2012. It was, I think he was a guy from New Zealand. Came to Burma, like 2011, the floodgates were open, all the economic sanctions went down. Burma became sort of quasi-democratic. And so a lot of Westerners just rushed in and just were looking around for ways to make money. You know, it's an unexploited capitalist dreamland, essentially, or at least in their idea. I mean, they went to Burma looking to make money. And this guy set up a bar, which is already kind of starting off on the wrong foot. And then he put out this advertisement showing the Buddha wearing headphones, kind of like a psychedelic colored Buddha wearing headphones. And he wound up in prison for that. because it's just mocking Buddhism. And in a Western country, you can do that kind of stuff, but in Burma, they don't put up with that shit. You know, it's like, this is our country. We are devoutly Buddhist. You come here mocking our religion with that shit, you go to prison, or you get deported, or you go to prison and then get deported. So, yeah, I mean, I can relate to the idea that what he's doing is offering a kind of degenerate form of Buddhism, maybe with the idea that degenerate Dharma is better than no Dharma at all. But that is debatable. Sort of like a lot of the stuff that goes on in the West. I mean, it's degenerate Dhamma, degenerate Buddhism. And you say, well, I mean, for some people at least, it's better than no Buddhism at all. But still, let's see, what is my take? I guess I'm giving my take right now, aren't I? I can sort of see both sides, but I think I would have to side with the traditionalists who are saying, I mean, music in general is not good Dhamma. I mean, like anyone who's keeping 8 precepts shouldn't even be listening to music. Certainly shouldn't be playing music or singing. Mahayana Buddhism, like, is in Korea. Maybe they've lightened up on the idea that music is wallowing in sensuality and therefore should be avoided. But yeah, from a Theravada point of view, yeah, I mean, he's already started off on the wrong foot by becoming a DJ playing Buddhist music, because playing music is not dharmic from a Theravada Buddhist point of view, which is one reason why Theravada Buddhist music tends to suck. Because there's going to be Theravada Buddhist music. It's just that it's kind of frowned upon. It's considered to be kind of, you know, bad behavior. And so, you know, it's not nearly as good as like Muslim music. Some Muslim is just really nice. So I guess I gave my take on that. That I do think that devoutly Buddhist countries would be justified in banning this guy. But I mean, I don't think that he should be punished or anything necessarily, unless he just knows that it's against the law in Burma, for example, and goes ahead and does it anyway, and then he's got to reap what he sowed. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from the 3 Holy Baskets. And this is kind of an easy question, even though I can't answer it very well, which is, can you do a video on the Pandura debate? And I'm not exactly sure what the Pandura debate is. I mean, it may be that he's referring to the debate, which was essentially the Second Great Council. But if it's the Pandura debate is not the Second Great Council, then I'm not sure what the Pandura debate is. So, I mean, he may want to specify, before I start going into a description of the Second Great Council, which I kind of touched on in a recent Q&A, maybe even the previous one. But yeah, the word Pandura, I'm not exactly sure. It's not capitalized either. So, I mean, theoretically, it could be like a town or city or something where this debate took place in ancient India, maybe. But I don't know. So I'm sorry. I apologize to the 3 Holy Baskets for not knowing what the Pandura debate is. Unless it's the Second Council. That's my guess. And if so, then if the 3 Holy Baskets would be so kind as to verify my guess that, yeah, you're referring to the Second Great Council, then I could give a discussion of the Second Great Council. But right now, I think I'm just going to move on to the next question, which is from Cleefy. And Cleefy says, could you share your knowledge on how to make the daily practice of sitting more consistent? Well, it's going to take adhitthana. It's going to take determination. That, I mean, if you're going to get a daily consistent practice of meditation, first you should pick, you know, at least one time per day when you are most likely to be able to dedicate that time to meditating. For most people, it's usually right when you get up in the morning or right before you go to bed, or both. So once you pick this time, then you stick to it. You have to use determination. even if you don't feel like it, even if you're not feeling so good that day, even if, you just don't want to do it at all, you still just have to do it. And if you're going to make a consistent practice of it, you have to have adhitthana, which is determination. You have to stick to it. And no other person can really do that for you. I mean, if you're at a meditation center and they're going to like punish you, you got in some old fashioned Zen monasteries where you got the guy with the stick, then yeah, I mean, that would be a way of spurring you on to consistent meditation practice. But I mean, sitting in a group is a good way of having consistent meditation practice, at least while you're sitting in a group, because it's kind of mortifying to be the only person who gets up and walks out. Everybody else is sitting there for the full hour, assuming that it lasts for an hour, so it kind of makes you ashamed to be the first one to get up and leave, for example. But if you're by yourself, then, I mean, you have to be on your own case. You have to beat yourself with a stick if necessary. And you just really have to make this firm determination. And if you can't do that, if you're just the kind of person who just falls off the wagon easily, then I'm sorry. I mean, nobody else can really make you do that. I'm not sure about any life hacks that can compensate for not having self-discipline other than just gradually cultivating self-discipline. And it may be that you fall off the wagon so many times that finally you get so disgusted with yourself that you just can't stand living with yourself, so that you're willing to really change and start doing it. So, yeah, in my case, I don't know, it's just, I just meditated a lot, especially my first 10 years as a monk. I mean, I was probably averaging like 6 hours a day of meditation my first 10 years as a monk. So even my first 20 years, it was probably averaging out to like 4 hours a day. That probably wouldn't even include walking meditation, just sitting there. So in that case, it's like my duty. I was a monk. Before I was a monk, I really didn't meditate very consistently. But after I became a monk, it's like, this is my job. This is my sacred duty. I can't just fuck around. I don't want to just blow it and waste it and become like a shameless, sloppy monk. So that was really the main thing that got me behaving, was actually being a monk and just being revered by the people as a kind of holy man and not wanting to be a fraud. So there's that possibility. That's the only way you can do consistent meditation, is by being ordained as a monk. Maybe you could go for that. And I'm going to move on to the next question. This is from Philalethes. And Philalethes says, you've probably been asked this before, but I was wondering what your opinion is on casual drinking. And I don't mean water or milk. Do you ever drink? And the fact is, yeah, I do drink alcohol sometimes. In fact, I had a shot of bourbon over ice with a little bit of orange bitters on it just last night, helping me unwind after work. So the thing is, drinking alcohol in and of itself is not necessarily immoral. I mean, Jesus drank alcohol, apparently, for example. And Socrates could drink anyone under the table. And he was considered to be, the wisest of the Athenians, the wisest of the Greeks, according to the Oracle of Delphi. So, I mean, just drinking alcohol in and of itself, especially if it's small amounts, like last night, it was like a shot of whiskey. I rarely get drunk. It does happen occasionally. I have gotten drunk since I stopped being a monk. But, and one time I spectacularly puked my guts out as a result of that. So, I mean, it's breaking a rule. It's breaking the fifth precept by drinking alcohol. And a monk is breaking a rule, even if he just takes some cough syrup that has some alcohol in it, or he drinks some fruit juice that has started to ferment in the hot weather, or takes some kind of medicine that he doesn't know has alcohol in it until he takes it and he tastes the alcohol. He's still broken the rule. And I mean, I had a friend, a Burmese monk when I was in Burma, who was repeating some sermon that he heard about drinking alcohol, how it was somebody was dared to break one of the 5 precepts. So he figured drinking alcohol would be the most minor of the 5 precepts, which it pretty much is. It's, the least, it's 5th on the list, 5th in importance, essentially. And so he said, well, I'll drink alcohol. So then he gets drunk, and then he goes out and starts raping and killing and stealing and winds up breaking all 5. And that's sort of like the justification for not drinking alcohol. If you get drunk, of course, your inhibitions go down. You become, at least most people become stupider. It's like the connection between your higher self, so to speak, and just, the ego, that kind of gets muddied or severed even in some people. I mean, some people just become monsters when they get drunk. One of my best friends in high school and college, he was like Richie Cunningham. I mean, he was just clean cut, this really good guy. His father was a police officer. He was raised to be really just polite, nice guy. But when he got drunk, he just went wild. And some people, it's like they have lots of inhibitions, and the alcohol kind of, it removes the inhibitions, and all this repressed stuff just splatters outwards. A lot of people are like that, especially certain quiet guys with like a really intense look in their eyes that you don't want to be around them when they get drunk. So, yeah, I do drink occasionally. I have a few times gotten drunk, but I like the taste of beer. Sometimes you come home on a hot day and a cold beer goes down. You don't want to drink something sweet. You don't want to drink coffee, which will just keep you up at night. I don't want to drink just plain water. Just a cold beer goes down really nice. So it is breaking a rule, but whether it's immoral or not depends on, how you drink and why you drink, how much you drink, that kind of thing. So I'm kind of a renegade, I guess. And I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is also from Philalethes, and he says, in older times, especially in China, many Buddhists, including monks and sages, were also Taoists. Mostly, I've only heard of Zen or Chan Buddhists that were also Taoists, but I'm curious what your opinion is on this. Is it possible to combine or even syncretize Taoism with Theravada and Mahayana? Personally, I find the Tao Te Ching and the Zhuangzi absolutely beautiful enigmatic texts, infinitely filled with wisdom, much like some suttas. So I was wondering to what extent one can utilize both. Well, yeah, you can be an eclectic. I mean, you can combine Christianity with Buddhism. You can combine Hinduism with Buddhism. Obviously, it's already combined. Hinduism and Buddhism, I mean, there's a lot of overlap between them. Taoism, there's even a theory that Lao Tzu was never a historical Chinese person, but was like a garbled version of the Buddha, which would make Taoism a kind of garbled version of Chinese Buddhism. But it's pretty clear that Zen Buddhism did really adopt certain Taoist ideas and attitudes. And Taoists probably accepted some Chan or Zen Buddhist ideas and attitudes. So, yeah, I mean, Taoism, if you read the text, I mean, there's not a whole lot of dogma that is going to interfere with Buddhism. Taoism is very kind of diffuse. It's just sort of, I don't know what the word is. I mean, it doesn't really set down any hard rules. You read the Tao Te Ching or the Zhuangzi, it doesn't have like this systematic philosophy like Theravada Buddhism does. And so they can fit together fairly well without a whole lot of conflict going on or contradiction. Something like Christianity and Buddhism, there's going to be considerable contradiction, and you're just going to have to pick what attitude to take, or else you can just be like a muddle-headed person and adopt two mutually contradictory attitudes or points of view. A lot of people do that. But Taoism really doesn't have any hard philosophy, at least not in the two main texts of it, where there's much to be in conflict with Buddhism. And so you can adopt more of this kind of a mystical, intuitive approach, which the Chinese generally did anyway with their Buddhism. And I don't think there's any problem. So, I mean, Theravada and Taoism, it might be a little harder fit than Mahayana and Taoism. Mahayana is just kind of more kind of diverse with regard to what it's willing to accept than Theravada is. But I really don't see anything in the Tao Te Ching that's really contradictory. I mean, I'm sure there's a few statements in there that could be interpreted as heresy from a Theravadan point of view. But yeah, I mean, some of it's really profound. Like one of my favorite verses of the Tao Te Ching, I've probably recited it more than once in these Q&A videos, is he who follows learning increases day by day. He who follows Tao decreases day by day. He becomes less and less until he has attained to non-action. With non-action, there is nothing that he cannot attain. And I mean, you could call that, I mean, if that were found in a Pali Sutta, then I don't think many people would have much difficulty in believing that the Buddha himself actually taught something like that. So, yeah, Taoism is so devoid of any concrete dogmatic philosophy that I think it can be superimposed on Buddhism fairly easily. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Rakasa. And Rakasa says, following up on the explanation of paññā's etymology, would you explain the etymologies of viññāna and saññā? Since they also seem to be based on the same verb as paññā, but are samsaric aggregates rather than transcendent of samsara. Yeah, so paññā, which generally is interpreted as wisdom in English or understanding, and then you've got viññāna, which is usually translated as consciousness in Theravada, although interestingly in Mahayana, I think, and I think in Hinduism, it has a different, it's almost means the same as perception. It's sort of like this individualist, like consciousness of something in particular, where it involves like discernment or distinctions or some such. And then you've got saññā, which means in Theravada Buddhism, perception. And they all have that ñā in them. And that ñā means knowledge. It's based on the same Proto-Indo-European root as the gno in gnosis, or the kno in knowledge. You know, the GN, the KN in English, and the JN in Sanskrit, which just becomes like enye, the N with the tilde over it in Pali. You know, it all comes from some prehistoric word that means to know. It means knowledge, knowing. So paññā is literally, it means fourth know, foreknowledge, kind of prognosis. You know, that PA in Pali has the same meaning as the English or Greek prefix PRO. So it means kind of a forward kind of a thing, and it means wisdom or understanding in general. Viññāna, the V at the beginning, it means separateness. So it's like apartness. So technically, it seems like the Mahayana interpretation or the Hindu interpretation of viññāna would be more in accordance with the literal meaning of the word, which means sort of like apart knowledge. It's sort of like distinguishing. Whereas somehow in Theravada or early Buddhism in general, it just came to mean consciousness in general. So maybe the VI was interpreted just as like an intensifier rather than with any connotations of like apartness or distinctness. And then saññā, that is perception, and the sun, the SAN or the SAM in Pali has the same etymology as CON in Latin. You know, it means like with or together. So it's like with knowledge, with know, saññā. And really it's doesn't seem to make a whole lot of sense calling it saññā. I mean, they could have all originally been practically synonyms, but just the literal interpretation of a word. I mean, the real meaning of it as it is used can be radically different. Like the word understanding in English. I mean, you're not standing under anything. I mean, it's the etymology does not help in understanding what the real meaning of the word is. And so it can be that way with regard to viññāna or saññā or any of these words. I mean, all of them have the root, which means knowledge or knowing, in it. But they've got different prefixes, which might just be added on there just to distinguish different kinds of knowing. So let's see. Since they also seem to be based on the same verb as paññā, but are samsaric aggregates rather than transcendent of samsara. Kind of, although like I keep saying, there are at least two texts in Theravada Buddhism, in the suttas, that identify nibbana, the ultimate, as infinite consciousness. The Upanishads also go with the idea of Brahman as infinite formless consciousness, although I don't recall what the Sanskrit word for consciousness would be in the Upanishads. It might not be viññāna, it might be something else. So it's just kind of arbitrary word juggling. I mean, words themselves really don't have much influence on the actual thing they represent, unless you're just a person who thinks that words actually determine things. Like, I guess the Greeks, a lot of the ancient Greeks believe that. But I'm digressing into weird territory. And so I'm just going to move on to Rakasa's next question here, which is, I have read that it is an offense in Theravada Vinaya to ordain someone with eczema. However, you have mentioned in the past that some ordinations remain valid even if doing so is an offense for the ordaining monks. Since I have eczema, can I be validly ordained if I persuade some monks to willingly make the offense? Well, I kind of had eczema. It wasn't really eczema, but I do have a tendency. I've got like a seborrheic skin type, so I get like seborrheic dermatitis fairly easily. If I don't take a bath for more than just a few days, I start breaking out in like a rash, which is sort of like an autoimmune allergic reaction kind of thing to like the bacteria that live in my skin oil, or to the waste products of the bacteria that are feeding on my skin oil. And I was ordained. It's like the way I did it, just so that I would have a clean conscience, is I kind of bathed regularly and just kind of used like dermatology cream, skin cream, to kind of clear it up, so that at the time I was ordained, I didn't have any symptoms of it. But if you do get ordained with eczema, for example, you're still ordained. It's a minor offense for the monks who ordain you, but it's still a valid ordination. I remember when I first came to Burma, I was staying at this monastery that a lot of monasteries in Burma will do temporary ordinations. It's called Donlaba ordination, where someone will come and be ordained for like a week or 2 weeks. You know, they've got some vacation time, or it's the New Year's celebration, which lasts about a week. You know, they'll come and they'll be ordained, and then they'll just disrobe after a week or two or a month or whatever. And there was a monk at the monastery who literally had leprosy. I mean, when I first saw his arm, it looked like pizza on his arm. It was just like open ulcerations on his arm. And at first I didn't know what it was. I'd never seen leprosy before at that time. I guess leprosy has pretty much been cured now. But at the time when I first went to Burma in the early 90s, you could still see people who were lepers, essentially. And he was ordained as a monk, and it was maybe a minor violation for the monks there who ordained him, but I guess he wasn't a legitimate monk. There is a list of diseases that you're not supposed to have if you're being ordained, and you have to answer that you don't have them at the ordination ceremony, which was the main thing. I didn't want to lie at my own ordination ceremony. So I at least made sure that I didn't have any symptoms. You know, I had the potential maybe, but technically I guess eczema and seborrheic dermatitis aren't the same. But I mean, eczema it just means like a skin disease. You know, if you got like an unsightly skin disease, it's going to scare villagers. You know, the main purpose with regard to something like that is you don't want a monk who's going to look like some kind of scary, monstrous kind of being. You know, like a lot of people are afraid of leprosy. I mean, especially in a culture, in a time when leprosy is a thing, people are kind of afraid of that. They don't want to be hanging out with someone with leprosy. Although the official reason given in the text is that the Buddha's personal physician was Jivaka the doctor, who was such a good doctor. He could cure anything. He could cure things that people can't cure even nowadays. And so monks or people with these diseases were joining the Sangha just to get treated by Jivaka because he was treating them for free because they were monks. And so finally, there were so many like people with diseases getting ordained, getting cured by Jivaka, and then just dropping out because they really didn't have a spiritual vocation, that the Buddha made a rule that if you have any of these diseases, which includes epilepsy, leprosy, like I mentioned, I think tuberculosis is on the list, the skin disease one, a few others. I think possibly even asthma is on the list, if I remember correctly. That you're not supposed to be ordained, but it's one of those things where even if you are ordained, it's a valid ordination. Unlike if you're not human and you get ordained, or if you're like a eunuch, you don't have a set of balls. You get ordained as a monk, it just doesn't apply at all. It's not a valid ordination. You're still not a monk. So yeah, eczema would be one of those where if you are ordained, it is a valid ordination, even though it's a minor offense. And I mean, the tricky part is you are questioned at your ordination and you are asked if you have these diseases, and you're supposed to say, you know, nati bande, you know, I don't have the venerable sir. And I mean, I certainly didn't want to start off kind of on the wrong foot at my ordination by lying. So at the very least, you could tell them that you do have this. And then, you know, if they are already forewarned that you do have it, it's not really a lie because you do not have the intention to deceive. In order to lie, you have to have the intention to deceive another person. And so if they already know that you do have this and you're just saying, I don't have it in Pali during the ordination ceremony, just for the sake of the formality of it, then, I mean, that's better than like telling a deliberate lie at your own ordination. So, yeah, you could be validly ordained with eczema. And so I'm going to move on to the next question. This is from Romeo. And we've been going for 2 hours now. By golly. Although we are at least 2/3 of the way through. So this isn't going to be any record-breaking long one. Although these Q&As tend to be very long, and some people have complained about how long they are, but I'm not exactly sure how to answer these questions in a short form. I guess I should just do more short videos on different subjects. Maybe I could just answer each question as a separate video. That'd just really blow out my algorithm, I think. Anyways, this next question is from Romeo, and Romeo says, even though I'm not a Christian, I enjoy the serenity prayer. God grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. For its succinct wisdom, can you recommend a similar equivalent, a sutta, mantra, etc. in Buddhism for accepting things in life with equanimity? And I've been thinking about this. I cannot think of an example of something that is similar to this. I mean, first of all, no prayers in Theravada, at least none in the texts. So, I mean, that's out. I mean, why not just go with this? I mean, you don't have to include the God word and just grant me the serenity, but then who's doing the granting, I guess? May I have the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. There you go. It's sort of like a blessing on yourself. In a way, sending metta to yourself. but I cannot think of anything really similar in Theravada. Maybe you could like read through the Dhammapada and find a verse that comes close to it. But it wouldn't be real super close. So I do apologize to Romeo for not really being able to come up with a Theravada Buddhist, a Pali equivalent to the Serenity Prayer, which I think is attributed to Saint Francis of Assisi. But yeah, I mean, if you really like it, just maybe you could just do the English, may I have the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. I mean, it works. I mean, I'm eclectic enough that I can accept wisdom from other systems, other schools, other religions. So, let's see. Yeah, one of my great comforting thoughts was actually, I think I ganked it from Christianity. I think it's something from the New Testament, but now I can't even remember what it was. So I'm just going to move on to the next question here. This is from Robert. And Robert says, I have to write an essay on a question based on metaphysical or epistemological themes in either Aristotle, Descartes, Leibniz, Locke, or Hume for my university course in the history of Western philosophy. What would be some interesting things to discuss, especially if I can incorporate some early Buddhist thinking while still keeping it focused on Western philosophy? Well, the first thing that came to mind is that David Hume actually had a kind of theory of anatta, which was in his first magnum opus, the treatise, I think it is. So, I mean, obviously, I mean, he was saying that there really is no self. There is no unified self, that it's just like perceptions that are arising and passing away. So it came very close to Buddhism. He kind of backed away from it later on, partly because he got a lot of pushback from it. And also partly because it was really hard for him to explain, if there is no unifying self, then how do these perceptions arise, subjectively, just in this one person, even though he's saying that there really is no person, at least not subjectively, that there is no abiding essence of a person's mental states. That is just sort of like in Buddhism, it's just this flux that is changing every moment. So, I mean, if you wanted to get some Western philosophy with a Buddhist flair to it, you could write something about Hume's theory of no self, which is in his first major work, which is his treatise. Another one that is possible is like Leibniz's monadology. I mean, it's not really a Theravadan idea, but it comes very close to like Yogacara Mahayana Buddhism, where everything in the world is this monad. It's like an atom, and the atom reflects the entire universe. Each atom is self-contained. It has no windows, and so you could just have one of these atoms, and all the rest of them could disappear. These monads, and that one remaining monad would be oblivious to the fact that everything else was gone, because there is no real interaction. It's sort of like in Yogacara Buddhism, they teach that there is no physical matter, and we're just kind of dreaming our reality through the power of karma. And it's just through like the infinitude of all the beings in the universe that we just happen to like interact. We dovetail, our karma dovetails with the karma of other beings, so that we can seem to interact when ultimately there is no real interaction. So those are the two main kind of Buddhist ideas. One is Theravada Buddhist, like Hume's idea of no self, and also Leibniz's monadology, which is just this weird idea. I wonder if Leibniz actually believed in his monadology, because it's such a bizarre kind of theory of reality. But yeah, I'd leave Descartes alone. He was not a particularly dharmic person as far as I can tell. Not that he was a bad person, it's just that his ideas were just going a very different direction. So I guess that's my two suggestions. Hume's idea of no self, which is found in his first major work, his treatise, or maybe Leibniz's monadology as I don't know, kind of as a kind of solipsism. And so I'm just going to move on to Robert's next question, which is, he says, maybe a response to Descartes' I think, therefore I am. Yeah, I guess you could refute Descartes. I mean, even, what's his name? Bertrand Russell. Yeah, he was already critiquing Descartes' I think, therefore I am, cogito ergo sum, where, yeah, I mean, he's saying that doesn't make sense. That doesn't really hold water. You know, you could just say thoughts arise. So there is no I think, therefore I am. It's just if thoughts are arising, then it's kind of like what Hume was saying. You know, you could just say the thoughts are arising with no self as a kind of vessel for the thoughts. So that's a possibility, I suppose. It would be more of a refutation of Descartes than, you know, really trying to, like, I mean, certainly shouldn't advocate for it. Not as a good Buddhist anyway. And so I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Alfred, who is different from Fred, who sometimes goes by the name of Alfred. This is a totally different Alfred. And Alfred says, I saw a video where these Chinese communist Buddhist monks are apparently worshiping the party flag. Religion is tolerated in China as long as the party comes first, which is why you see the General Secretary's picture in churches. Some monks are even registered as communist members. I guess when there's power and money to be made, even monks become a business. As a former Buddhist monk, how would you reconcile this if you were that position? Would you go along to get along, try to fight the system, or just leave altogether? Well, if I were a Buddhist monk and let's say the Burmese government, which they wouldn't do because they tend to be at least superstitious Buddhists, you know, they do not deny Dhamma, even if they don't follow it very well. And if they somehow, through some weird, you know, you have this, the military dictator just kind of goes psycho, you know, he has like a Nero moment or something and says, you know, all the monks have to bow down to me. Yeah, I think I'd probably leave Burma. And if I was Burmese, I think I'd just go out into a remote forest area where the government generally doesn't have tentacles reaching that far. And I assume even in China, there are like remote areas where a monk could live. And hopefully he won't be living there and get a reputation for being like some sage, which will then, you know, as soon as the word spreads to the authorities, you know, they'll have to go and interrogate him or something because they don't want him, you know, making trouble. But yeah, I mean, there's not much point in being a Buddhist if you're going to be worshiping the communist Chinese flag. I mean, different people become monks for different reasons. Maybe they just want to live an easy life. Maybe they think that, you know, the benefits of being a monk will kind of compensate for the, you know, the detrimental effect of worshiping this flag in order to keep the government off their back. But yeah, I mean, in Vinaya, there is a rule where the monk says, or where the Buddha says, monks, I allow you to obey kings. And the main reason for that in the text, according to the context of the story, was that the king was decreeing an intercalary month. You know, this year, the month, there's going to be 13 months instead of just 12, which you have to do with the Buddhist calendar, the ancient Indian calendar, because it's based on the moon more than on the sun. So, I mean, you could sort of use something along those lines. It's like, you know, the government says we have to worship this flag. At least we could sort of bow down to it just because, I mean, we're just obeying the law and we don't give a shit about the flag necessarily. It's just we are required to do it outwardly, even though inwardly it's just we're being mindful of the bending and, you know, the pressure of our knees and our forehead against the floor and all that. But I think if you read the Visuddhimagga and you're hearing about these great Arahant monks in like ancient early medieval Sri Lanka, who, I mean, they wouldn't do that stuff. They'd rather just get tortured to death than, you know, sort of sully Dhamma by putting it the same level as Xi Jinping, or the communist Chinese flag. So, yeah, I have read a lot about, or seen a lot about China, how they're actually like redacting parts of the Bible to make it more in accordance with Chinese communism. And yeah, they're taking down like crosses from the altars in Christian churches and putting up a big picture of Chairman Xi, that kind of thing, which is, yeah, I mean, I don't really do well under situations like that. There's a good chance I might wind up being the ones who got tortured to death. Anyhow, I'm just going to move on to the next question, which is from Rui. And Rui says, what are your thoughts on upspeak from a Dhammic perspective, considering that utter attention should be paid not only to language, but also to enunciation? And I assume by enunciation, it's essentially the same as pronunciation. And upspeak, I'm not familiar with the term. It's not part of my working vocabulary. I know what up means, and I know what speak means, but upspeak, I mean, I'm not familiar with the term. So what are my thoughts on upspeak from a Dhammic perspective, considering that utter attention should be paid not only to language, but also to enunciation? So it seems that upspeak might mean like you have to have exactly perfect pronunciation. And there is some of that in Theravada Buddhism when monks are reciting a formal act of the Sangha, where if you pronounce the Dhamma, or you pronounce Pali incorrectly in accordance with Burmese tradition, and Burmese have weird pronunciation, but if you pronounce, you know, like a B instead of a P, you stutter your words and say a word wrong, that can invalidate the formal act of the Sangha. So in Burma, often they'll have 3 monks all reciting the same thing in the formal act, just to make sure that at least one of them hasn't messed up the Pali, so that they're actually doing it according to the rules. And my teacher, Venerable Pakoku Sayadaw, who was taught at a monastic school in the city of Pakoku, which is how he got his name, Pakoku Sayadaw, the pronunciation of Pali according to the Pakoku tradition is even weirder than the pronunciation of Pali in ordinary Burmese tradition. And I was told that he was doing so many ordination ceremonies, like for these Donlapa temporary monks during like New Year's week, that he actually herniated himself using like the explosive fricative, or just like you have to say like an aspirated consonant. Like, you know, in Pali, it differentiates between P and PH, between B and BH, between T and TH, and so forth. And these H's have to be pronounced in order to do it correctly. So it's like, Thuna du me bande tham go, the way you have to pronounce this, like, Suna du me bante sam go. He actually herniated himself doing one of these Sangho kind of a things. And I mean, really, like an Indian or like a Sri Lankan monk listening to Burmese pronunciation will just laugh at just how bizarre it is. Thai pronunciation also is pretty weird. They kind of mix P with B and D with T. So Buddha becomes Puta, not in the Spanish sense, but in a Thai sense. And it's just, so, I mean, you have to pronounce it correctly according to the tradition that you're in. But, I mean, Pali technically is a dead language, and nobody can know for sure exactly how it was pronounced in ancient times. Probably the Sinhalese pronunciation comes closest. But like the Mun pronunciation, the Thai pronunciation, the Burmese pronunciation, the Pakoku pronunciation, they all have these weird, like, idiosyncrasies. Like in Burma, Burmese pronunciation of Pali, S is pronounced like TH. Like you don't say Sangha, you say Thanga. And I don't know why that what happened, unless maybe there was a king that had a lisp, 500 years ago, and it just became the vogue, the fashion to speak with the same lisp as the king or something. I don't know about that. So, I mean, you should get the words right, especially in a formal act of the Sangha, but what is right in one part of the Buddhist world is going to be different from what is right in another part of the Buddhist world. So, those are some of my thoughts on upspeak, assuming that I understand what upspeak is. I guess it just means like being very hard-nosed with regard to saying everything exactly right. And I mean, that was a big thing for the Brahmins in, Vedic Brahmanism, that you had to pronounce the hymns from the Rig Veda and the other Vedas perfectly when you were doing the fire sacrifice. Because if you stuttered your words or you slurred your words, you didn't say a word right, you had to start over. And I think that was one of the theories about where the whole idea of karma comes from. Karma means act, like in a formal act. Like Sangha Kama is a formal act of the Sangha in Pali. That, it's like you have to do everything just right in order for the act to be like skillfully done. So that's one theory about the origin of the very idea of karma. Although there's another theory that I think I might give a little more credence to, is that the theory of karma was part of some of the philosophical systems of the prehistoric Indus Valley civilization, which eventually got kind of syncretized with early Vedism. Or maybe not even so early anymore, around a little bit before the Buddhist time. So aside from that, I'm really not 100% sure what upspeak means. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Yuga'u. And just going to scroll down. We still got a few questions to go here. Yuga'u says, my first question today is to correct my last. The samyojana I wanted you to correctly explain and give examples of is rites and rituals. So it'd be silabata. So he says, my opinion is that there is no subconscious to begin with. Oh, I guess that's a different question. So let's just make a space between those two. Okay. So he wanted me to explain the samyojana or fetter of silabata, which sometimes is translated as rites and rituals, but originally, like you read the Atthakavagga, which is very ancient Buddhist text, one of the most ancient of all Buddhist texts, archaic Buddhism, pre-Theravadan, it talks a lot about silabata. And it's saying that silabata isn't going to get you enlightened. The opposite of silabata also isn't going to get you enlightened. And Theravada, Orthodox Theravada, didn't really understand this. So if you look in the commentaries, what is this silabata that's being talked about? They say that silabata is doing really absurd, like ritual practices, like imitating the behavior of dogs or cattle. And clearly that's not what it means when you're reading the Atthakavagga and it's talking about silabata. It's talking about morality and observances. So morality would be any kind of act that has like a karmic, like an ethical aspect to it. So you avoid doing something that is immoral or unethical, whereas an observance isn't necessarily ethical at all. Like a monk having to shave his head every 2 months or 2 finger widths, whichever comes first. At least that much. I mean, there's nothing immoral about not shaving your head. There's nothing immoral about having long hair. Or also, like, a monk is only allowed to eat between dawn and midday. But there's nothing inherently immoral about eating dinner in the late afternoon, for example. There's not even anything immoral about eating something in the middle of the night. It's just an observance. So the sila part is morality, not killing, not lying, not stealing, that kind of stuff. And the observances are just proper way of pronouncing the words in an ecclesiastical act, shaving the head, the robes being a certain way, that kind of stuff. And clinging to that is called silabhata paramasa. Even if it's morality, even just doing what is good, if you're clinging to that and you're just worried about whether, you're being good enough or whether what you just did was right or wrong, and you're just kind of stewing over it, then, that's like an attachment. It's like an attachment to samsara, because these actions are all samsaric actions. But it's certainly not just rites and rituals. It is literally morality and observances. And the morality is like the rules of an ethical nature, or practices of an ethical nature, and observances are rules or practices that aren't necessarily ethical. It's just like etiquette, or this is just the way it's done kind of a stuff. So clinging to it just messes you up. And if you read the Atthakavagga, there'll be a lot of discourse on that. The Atthakavagga even says that a monk should not follow rules, which just flies in the face of later developments in Theravada with this immense code of monastic discipline. It does mention the patimokkha in the Atthakavagga, but it's not referring to rules. In fact, it's a little bit controversial exactly what patimokkha originally meant. It came to mean this codified rule, or a set of rules, 227 rules for monks. But apparently before that, it meant something else. It was like on Uposatha Day that like the senior monk would give a sermon, which was called the patimokkha, just kind of a how to train yourself kind of stuff. And then eventually it just came to mean on the full moon and new moon, the monks would just recite these rules. So, yeah, so I guess I explained that. But you shouldn't cling to even morality. You shouldn't cling to immorality or amorality either. You shouldn't cling to anything. But clinging to morality and observances is one of the impediments to progress in Dhamma. So I'm just going to move on to Yugu's next question, which is, my opinion is that there is no subconscious to begin with. It's just lack of mindfulness on part of them mundane actions being so habitual. What do you think? Well, if you're not being mindful of it, you're not fully aware that it's there, which would make it subconscious. The way karma works, that has to be subconscious if you're not fully aware of how karma is working, but karma is mental states. So your mental states are conditioning your reality from one moment to the next, and you're not aware of that happening. So that would be subconscious, or latent tendencies. That, you have this latent tendency to behave in a certain way, but it's not being like stimulated. It's just kind of lying dormant. So that also would be a kind of subconscious mind. But it's like the mind that is creating your dreams at night with the symbolism. There is dream symbolism. Freud was actually right about that. There is dream symbolism, and you might not even get the symbols that your own mind is conjuring up. Like my favorite example of that is the Australian monk friend of mine who was sort of thinking about disrobing, and he eventually did. And he had this weird dream, and he didn't understand this dream when he was telling me about it. And it just clicked for me immediately. I knew exactly what it meant, that he was in this canoe with like 3 gorillas, and he's just having to paddle around and around the middle of this lake with these gorillas who were just sitting there very peacefully. But he knew that if he paddled back to land, those gorillas were going to just jump out and run amok. And so he was just kind of trapped, just paddling around and around in this canoe with these gorillas. And it was pretty obvious to me, like according to Freud, water in dreams usually represents spirit. It's sort of the religious life, the spiritual life, dharma. So him being in that canoe was like him being a monk, him living the holy life, so to speak. And those gorillas were like his latent tendencies, his defilements, that if he went back to land and disrobed, they're going to run amok. And he didn't even get it. It was his own dream. His own mind conjured it up. But getting back to Yugu here in this theory, there is no subconscious to begin with. I think until you're fully mindful, until you're fully enlightened, there's going to be aspects of your mind that you're not aware of, partly because that you identify, people in general identified with their ego. And the ego is not all there is to the mind. It's just the ego is the part that is like self-referential and thinks that that's all there is. But there's all this other stuff, like the dream symbols, for example, or karma at a more metaphysical level that we are not aware of. And there is this interesting theory that a fully enlightened being would have no subconscious mind. I mean, he'd just be mindful of all of it going on. But until you reach that stage, there's going to be aspects of your mind that your ego isn't aware of. And unfortunately, Theravada Buddhism really doesn't have much of a theory about subconscious mind. I think to some degree, the Abhidhamma scholars dropped the ball on that one. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Joe Doe. And Joe Doe says, why do you think such a highly advanced being as Ajahn Chah suffered such a plight? Many people nowhere near his level don't suffer such things. And what he's referring to is that Ajahn Chah had diabetes, I'm pretty sure, and had like a diabetic stroke and just became like a vegetable. The last several years of his life, he was essentially like a drooling vegetable being pushed around in a wheelchair. And see, it's uncertain to me that he really was suffering. I mean, it was like he wasn't there anymore. It was just like this drooling body with, I mean, the spirit of Ajahn Chah might not have even been there anymore. I mean, it was like the mental processes of Ajahn Chah, his karma, so to speak. I mean, I don't know enough about what it was like being around Ajahn Chah after he had the stroke or whatever it was that made him become this vegetable. Whether he had any lucid moments at all, I'm not aware of. I mean, when he was in like the vegetative state, I don't think that he was suffering. And it might be that he just wasn't there. He was off. It may be just going with the idea of a spirit. His spirit may have just left his body. During lucid moments may have returned briefly. But, yeah, I mean, Neem Karoli Baba, who also was very advanced spiritually, he also suffered a kind of diabetic stroke and died. But for him, it happened fairly quickly. And if you read Ram Dass's book about him, Miracle of Love, Stories about Neem Karoli Baba, which I highly recommend, he apparently was like dropping hints that he knew he was going to die soon, but nobody wanted to take the hint because they didn't want to think about that, because he was their guru and they were, devoted devotees and all that. So it could be that Ajahn Chah suffered such a plight just due to his karma. I mean, I mentioned before, Mahamoggallana was literally beaten to a pulp, according to tradition. And he realized that it was his karma. He escaped the first 2 times, but they kept coming after him. And so he realized that it was just inevitable that it was going to have to happen. So the 3rd time, he just let them beat him to a pulp because it was some previous karma that had to work itself out. And presumably that was the case with Ajahn Chah also. Although whether he was suffering or in misery or anything, I'm not so sure about that, because it may be that, after he became the vegetable in the wheelchair, it was just like an empty shell, still metabolizing like someone in a coma kind of. But I really don't know enough about what Ajahn Chah was like after he had that attack, whether he was lucid at all or whether he was just out of it. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Siovaksh and Sipad Zidana. And Siovaksh and Sipad Zidana says, psychedelics can induce mystical experiences. Doesn't this kind of debunk all of spirituality, as it shows that these states are just a result of brain chemistry, thus ultimately a result of a materialist framework? And I would say, no, it doesn't debunk that at all. I mean, first of all, let's say that you're not even a materialist, then there's no brain chemistry other than as a perception. And the only brain chemistry anybody has any awareness of is a perception. So you have a perception of taking this drug, which, going with somebody like Mary Baker Eddy would say, it's a kind of placebo effect. that you take the drug fully believing it's going to have that effect, and also the people around you may have that expectation that you're going to get high from taking it, and it works as a kind of gimmick, like tarot cards or Ouija boards or something. So that's a possibility. I mean, for Siovaksh and Sifat Zidana to say that if you take a drug, it affects your mind, that debunks all of spirituality. That's just weird. And it doesn't even show that these states are just a result of brain chemistry. I mean, your brain chemistry, assume for the sake of argument that we have brain chemistry. So, I mean, your brain chemistry does not have the job of causing you to experience reality. Your brain chemistry has the job of keeping you alive long enough to have babies, preferably in such a way that your babies live long enough to have babies of their own. I mean, just going with like Darwin. So your brain chemistry your brain is not designed for you to experience reality. I mean, if you were fully enlightened, that would probably be counterproductive from the Darwinian point of view of survival of the fittest. If you're an arahant, you're much less likely to have babies. So, I mean, just because you take something and it disturbs your brain chemistry in such a way that you actually see reality more clearly, you know, it messes up the delusion so that you're actually able to see through the delusion to some degree. I mean, even if there is such a thing as material substances and brain chemistry, there's nothing debunked at all. So you take a drug that messes with your brain chemistry, and your brain chemistry is not designed to experience reality. You do not experience reality. Even mainstream science says that the stuff we perceive in our surroundings is not ultimately real, or at the very least, it's radically different from the way we perceive it. So then you take some drug that interferes with natural brain chemistry, and in some cases, it'll cause you to see more clearly. So, yeah, it doesn't debunk anything, really. Even from a materialistic framework, it still doesn't necessarily debunk anything. Because even materialists admit that your brain chemistry, the purpose of it is not for you to experience ultimate reality. So I'm just going to move on to Siovaksh and Sipat Zidana's next question. What do you make of the 16 steps of the Anapanasati Sutta, which is Majjhima Nikaya number 118? The instructions seem not to make much sense. Well, as it turns out, I happen to have Venerable Nyanamoli and Bhikkhu Bodhi's translation of the Majjhima Nikaya right here. And it just happens to turn out I've got a bookmark right at the Anapanasati Sutta. And I have to agree, I never had much use for the Anapanasati Sutta. And even the instructions in the Satipatthana Sutta, which are very similar with regard to mindfulness of breathing, it's just the instructions are not good instructions. Like, for example, let's see, even with regard to the very first part, breathing in long, he understands, I breathe in long. Breathing out long, he understands, I breathe out long. Breathing in short, he understands, I breathe in short. Or breathing out short, he understands, I breathe out short. He trains thus, I shall breathe in, experiencing the whole body. He trains thus, I shall breathe out, experiencing the whole body. He trains thus, I shall breathe in, tranquilizing the body formation. He trains thus, I shall breathe out, tranquilizing the body formation. It's like nobody should meditate like that. If you're doing mindfulness of breathing, even just breathing in, breathing out, even that's kind of overdoing it in my opinion. It may be good as an elementary practice, but it's like, I breathe in long, you've got I in every single breath. What good is that from a Buddhist point of view? And then it continues, it's like, I shall breathe in, experiencing rapture. Why would anybody try to set themselves up like that? It just is not good advice. He trains thus, I shall breathe in, experiencing the mind. But while you're breathing in, you're thinking all this stuff. It's not good advice, in my opinion. He trains thus, I shall breathe in, contemplating impermanence. But it's like whoever like came up with the finished version of that sutta, it's like they used language. I mean, they could have explained it much more clearly or much more effectively, but I mean, they've got it all like in the future tense. I will cultivate this, and while you're breathing in and out, you're supposedly doing mindfulness of breathing, and you're thinking there, I will experience rapture while you're breathing. I mean, what is the point of that? It's like if you're doing mindfulness of breathing, you're supposed to be mindful of the breathing, and then whatever happens, let it happen. So yeah, I've never had much use for the sutta, and I kind of doubt that the Buddha would have taught such a kind of, I don't know, it's just sort of clumsily, it's like a clumsy attempt at explaining the progress you make while doing mindfulness of breathing. But in reality, in all likelihood, you're just doing mindfulness of breathing, and stuff like the rapture and the awareness of impermanence and so forth arise as a kind of insight, or just they arise spontaneously. It's not like you're trying to make yourself do this stuff, because I mean, just about any meditation master is going to tell you to stay away from, I mean, thinking a lot for starters, thinking in the future tense, thinking about yourself, I will do this, I will do that, I am breathing in short, I am breathing in long. It's just a clumsy attempt at explaining this stuff. And I don't know how such a clumsy attempt wound up in the text, unless I'm just grossly misunderstanding. So what do I make of the 16 steps in the Anapanasati Sutta? Yeah, I don't really value that advice. At least it doesn't work for me. It might work for other people, and that's fine. It just doesn't work for me, and I'm skeptical of how authentic a teaching like that would be, supposedly coming from a fully enlightened being who is giving what seems to be really bad advice with regard to how to meditate on the breath. So I think I'm just going to move on to Siyovaksha Sipat Zirna's next question here. In Majjhima Nikaya number 108, Ananda is asked if the Buddha praises all kinds of meditation. Ananda says he did not praise meditation on ill will, sensuality, sloth and torpor, restlessness and worry, or doubt. The Pali word used is jhāna, which means the Buddha does not praise jhanas based on the 5 hindrances. Usually these are considered to be hindrances to jhana, but this text seems to imply you can have wrong jhanas based on these as well. The translators seem to have just translated jhanam as meditation. What is your best interpretation of what this word actually means? Well, literally, the word jhana means something like blazing or illumination. And originally, it probably just meant meditation. And the 4 jhanas were probably, as I've said multiple times before, just the 4 stages of meditation. So, I mean, first jhana, you're still thinking, how is that a superhuman mental state? So it got turned into a kind of superhuman mental state, possibly by like scholar monks who are more interested in formulating doctrine than in actually meditating themselves. They really didn't understand it. And so you wind up with meditation itself turning into a superhuman mental state. Like right concentration is the 4 jhanas, which probably just meant right concentration was, the 4 levels of meditation. And then it got turned into a superhuman mental state. An Udari Manusa Dhamma. So jhana originally, like in the Atthakavagga, a monk is called a jayi, someone who meditates. So probably jhana, even though literally it means something like illumination, effectively in common parlance, it came to mean just meditation. And then in Theravada Buddhism, it became like these 4 superhuman mental states, and then in Abhidhamma it turned into 5, and then 4 more formless jhanas were added as a kind of annex to 4th jhana, and then even higher states got added to that, like cessation of perception and feeling, or the signless perception of mind and so forth. But I think in certain other schools of Buddhism, jhana just meant meditation, like the Zen school. Zen is Japanese for the Chinese word chan, and chan is Chinese for the Sanskrit word jhāna or John. So it was just the meditation school. It wasn't the school that does the 4 jhanas, because as far as I know, in Zen Buddhism, they don't even have the concept of these 4 jhanas that are mentioned so many times in the polytext and always in the same rote, just stock formulas. So yeah, jhana probably just meant meditation, and then it got turned into a superhuman mental state. So I'm just going to move on to the next question here. And we are getting close to the bottom. We are getting close to the end here. So it'll be kind of a manageable 3-hour long. I mean, why watch, the sequel to Dune when you can just watch this Q&A instead? There's no aliens or explosions, I'm sorry to say. It would really liven up the Q&As. But some people like listening to me answer questions, and God bless you, or, well, just bless you, and just non-specifically. So the next question is from Stellar Supreme, formerly known as Lieberlam. And Stellar Supreme asked this question in such, Stellar Supreme is apparently a very cerebral kind of guy who may be even a little bit on the spectrum or something, who asks these cerebral complex questions. And so he asked this question on the Discord, on the Discord server in the Q&A room, and he immediately was kind of ridiculed by someone else, saying, "You always ask these questions in the most confusing, complicated way possible." So I think he edited it and changed it, and then finally he just deleted his entire attempt and included this question below all that. So this is like the final version of this question, which is, which did you find more enriching, peak meditation or psychedelics? And that's fairly easy. What I found more enriching was peak meditation. But psychedelics do have their advantages. For example, you can take a tab of acid, for example. I'm not suggesting anyone do this, mind you. But you could take a tab of acid and be fairly confident that there was going to be some significant effect happening within the next 30 to 45 minutes. With meditation, you may be renouncing the world, going off into a cave, struggling and floundering for years before you experience anything as profound as, say, an insight from an acid trip. But when you do get there, first of all, it's more clear. Your mind isn't like under the influence of drugs other than your own brain chemistry, assuming that we have any of that. Just for the sake of argument, let's assume that there's brain chemistry. So, it's like there's no doubts about it, really. Like, after you come down from like a psychedelic trip, especially, you can think, well, I was high. And there's going to be like all this distracting stuff, like the psychedelic colors and distortions and so forth that come with an acid trip, which are not there in meditation. You're still straight. And it's just, you're just seeing everything with crystal clarity. And, it's like there's nobody there in a sense. It's just like the mind is just like glass or a mirror or something. So peak meditation definitely was better, but it's a hell of a lot more difficult and not as reliable unless you've just got talent. You're just a natural born meditator. And some people are like that. Some people just sit down their first meditation retreat and they just become like a statue. So yeah, definitely my best meditation was more enriching than any acid trip I ever took. Although I might not have ever become a monk if I hadn't taken psychedelics first, because it gives you like a glimpse of what is possible. It helps you to see through the veil to some degree. It kind of destabilizes or disrupts your ordinary unenlightened brain chemistry, so to speak. Not that I'm advising anybody to take psychedelics. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Austin. And Austin says, what is your thoughts on Eastern Orthodoxy? Do you see any similarities to Buddhism? And I really am no authority on Eastern Orthodoxy. I think most of what I know about Eastern Orthodoxy I read in like Gibbon's Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. And like early medieval history, like Byzantine history, that kind of stuff. That's where most of the stuff I learn about Eastern Orthodoxy. I've read a few of Thomas Merton's books. He wrote some essays like on Mount Athos, which is like a male-only, strictly Orthodox monastic. I think it's like a little, what do you call it? Like an isthmus, not an isthmus, like a little thing of land that juts out, a peninsula. That's it. It's a peninsula. But really, I haven't read a whole lot of like Eastern Orthodox saints who have written. Like I've read a fair amount of Catholic stuff. You know, I've read St. John of the Cross and St. Teresa of Avila and like St. Francis of Assisi, that kind of stuff. But I've never really gotten into, just because of, you know, where I was born and the just cultural reasons, I guess, got into Eastern Orthodox Christianity other than just in a historical context. But with regard to my thoughts on Eastern Orthodoxy, with regard to any similarities to Buddhism, well, I mean, most religions worthy of the name religion, other than just some sort of cult, you know, at the basic level of morality, they tend to be fairly similar. You know, don't kill, don't steal, don't lie, you know, honor your mother and father, that kind of stuff. That's pretty much uniform throughout most religious systems. So, I mean, there would be that similarity. Also, I have been told that some Eastern Orthodox mystics were essentially like St. John of the Cross or St. Teresa of Avila. I mean, they were mystics. And, you know, they wrote about it. There's a lot of literature on Eastern Orthodox mysticism where, I mean, they may have been experiencing states that are essentially the same kind of states that ancient Indian Buddhist monks experienced, although, of course, they would interpret them differently. You know, they'd have to use Christian jargon instead of ancient Indian jargon. So there may be enlightened Eastern Orthodox monks or Christians. It wouldn't surprise me at all, especially after reading some of the Catholic stuff. So, yeah, I think that the main difference, I mean, it's mostly cultural differences. And it may be like an enlightenment tradition, at least for the heavy hitters that have renounced the world, similar to Buddhism. You know, you've got two different levels. You've got the layperson and you've got the monastic or the renunciant, which in the West, people don't like that distinction. But I mean, that's just because they're egalitarian Americans that don't really like anyone being better than them, kind of a situation. But in like the older pre-Protestant schools of Christianity, it was kind of similar, where you had the lay people and then you had like you also had like the secular clergy who were just kind of like lay people, really. And then you had like the monks, the monastics, that would just go into a cell or go out into a hut in the forest, and they would do a lot of meditation, what a Buddhist would call meditation. So there are similarities. It's just that Christianity kind of has the cross to bear, so to speak, of all the Jesus stuff, and Jesus dying for our sins, and the only begotten Son of God Almighty, and all this kind of stuff that, in my opinion, gets in the way of genuine Dharma or genuine spirituality. I mean, you can still become enlightened as a Christian so long as you don't cling to this. Like if you're practicing what a Catholic would call high contemplation, then you're not thinking anything. And so at least while you're doing that, you're not going to be fettered by clinging to these dogmas. And Buddhists cling to dogmas too. It's not just a Christian thing. So there are similarities. I'm no authority on Eastern Orthodox Christianity, though, so I can't really get into a whole lot of detail. But I mean, obviously, at the superficial levels, they're similar with regard to just morality and so forth. And then probably at the higher levels, I have seen enough evidence that the Eastern Orthodox Church has had saints and sages similar to like Meister Eckhart and St. John of the Cross. So I'm sure they've got their own enlightenment traditions. So, also I was told just recently that the feast day of Saint Josaphat in the Orthodox Church has recently occurred, and Saint Josaphat was a previous incarnation of the Buddha, according to the Jataka tales. But we don't need to get into that. So finally, we got one last question. This is the last question, and it's from Terzaskazes. And Terzaskazes says, please explain once again dependent co-arising. And he's just doing this to be difficult. Because, the Buddha himself did not really succeed, apparently, in describing or explaining dependent co-arising. In fact, according to the legend, he was not even going to teach Buddhism. He was going to become like a hermit Pacceka Buddha, and just go off and live in a cave somewhere and not try to teach Dhamma to anybody, because he figured nobody would understand dependent co-arising. And now I'm supposed to describe it. I'm supposed to explain it. So, first of all, the 12 links were probably devised by monks who also did not fully understand dependent co-arising. Of all the monks, all the Buddhists who have attempted to explain dependent co-arising, I think the best job was done by Venerable Nagarjuna, who is not a Theravada Buddhist. Although in his Mula Majjhimaka Karaka, in which he puts forth his understanding of dependent co-arising, he refers only to the older Buddhist texts and doesn't use any kind of references to Mahayana scriptures or any kind of Mahayanist ideas like the Bodhisattva concept. So with that as kind of an introduction, I guess, what is dependent co-arising? Well, the short form is, see, this being, that is, this arising, that arises, this not being, that is not, this ceasing, that ceases. That's like the short version of dependent co-arising, and it comes closer to what the gist of dependent co-arising is. It's dependent co-arising is how this world of multiplicity arises. You've got, everything has to have conditions. Everything that arises in samsara is conditioned, and each one of these conditions, conditioning it, is also conditioned. So you have this infinitely complex web of conditions and conditions and conditions that really are mutually supporting, and they're not really based on anything. They have no substance other than just the absolute which pervades everything, sort of, you can say, even though it's completely off the scale and defies any kind of attempts at valid explanation. So, dependent co-arising, the 12 link theory just assumes the reality of samsara, and its dependent co-arising is just how rebirth occurs within the context of samsara. But ultimately, originally, I think dependent co-arising was just explaining samsara, not just what goes on inside samsara, but how samsara arises. And it arises through this, you've got a virtual webwork of conditions that are all creating this illusion of like a well-established universe. But this is so hard to explain. The Buddha couldn't do it. How am I going to do it? But it really is, it's sort of like dependent co-arising. Everything, it's sort of contained within the name itself. Padicca samuppada. Padicca literally means having relied on or because of. Sam is together. Upada is arising. So it's dependent is the padicca part. Co is the sam, and padicca and the upada is arising. So it's dependent co-arising. And it's like nothing arises alone. There's always this context. It's like figure and ground, where the context is like the ground that is sort of conditioning the figure, and the figure itself is the ground for other things. And it's like there is no abiding essence to any of it. It's what Nagarjuna called emptiness or voidness. He said dependent co-arising is what we mean when we say emptiness, because you seem to have these phenomena going on, but they have no underlying essence. They are without essence, and it's just this seeming webwork of conditions, none of which has essences, but it's like they're causing each other to appear to exist in this weird way that neither I nor Gautama Buddha himself could really explain very well. Or if the Buddha did explain it, nobody got it. That was one part of his teachings that few people really understood, which kind of bears out his feelings in the legend. As soon as he became enlightened, he was just going to keep his mouth shut because he figured nobody was going to understand it. But it is like it's all happening now. It's not this chain of events, this cause and effect like the 12 links theory, which is standard Orthodox theory. Even Nagarjuna had to include one chapter on the 12 links just because it was already established dogma. You couldn't erase that part. It was just, you're stuck with it. So you have to do the best you can, which is what a lot of Christians have to do. Even though they might be extremely wise, they might be saints and sages, but still they can't just dismiss all this Christian dogma that is found right there in the Bible. So, explaining dependent co-arising, I think I must have at least one essay in my books in which I'm really trying to do my best with a clear monastic mind at the time about what is dependent co-arising, how exactly it works. And I don't know if I can really do it justice after talking straight for 3 hours. But I gave it a shot. It's not easy to explain, and the Buddha knew that it wasn't going to be easy, and he went ahead and tried it anyway. And I really don't think that there are very many people in this world who really understand dependent co-arising, even though it is considered to be central to Buddhist philosophy. It's considered to be one of the most important aspects of Buddhist philosophy because it really is like the theory of everything. So in a way, it's sort of like the Orthodox Buddhist attempt at explaining the theory of everything, whereas my own theory of everything is the uncarved block with these virtual statues that are kind of mutually interacting and conditioning each other. So that would be like, you could try to think of it in that way if it helps any. But it just transcends rational thought, I think. The brain simply is not designed to understand this stuff. So trying to understand this stuff with an ordinary human mind is sort of like trying to pound nails with a screwdriver or something. So I guess I should just admit defeat on that one and call it good. And that's it. That was the last question. So you guys all know the drill. I don't know why I always wait until the very end before saying this, because some people, they won't listen to the whole thing and they'll say, where can I ask questions? But where you can ask questions is down below in the comments. And you can ask about practically anything. Who knows? Maybe if you ask something completely at random, I still might be able to answer it. Although generally Theravada Buddhism, meditation in general, like Burma, that kind of stuff, ancient India, how Buddhism began, how it arose, what the earliest Buddhism was probably like. Me personally, this kind of stuff I can generally answer. I know a fair amount about Western philosophy. I know a fair amount about other Eastern traditions like Hinduism, a little bit about Taoism. So if you have questions about that sort of thing, feel free to ask in the comments below. If you have access to Subscribestar, you can ask there. If you have access to the Discord server, you can ask there. And like and subscribe if you have not done so already, and be happy.